Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be discussing some English home language approaches, tips and techniques to assist you for paper 1. So this is how your English home language DBE paper 1 exam is set out. It's always important to have an understanding of what you're getting into and what you need to be preparing for. So it's a 2-hour exam worth 70 marks, and the big thing that is being tested in this exam, obviously you have 3 English papers, and each of the English papers has a different expectation and a different thing that the markers are looking for, a different aspect of English that they're testing. So this exam, what they're testing is your reading ability and how you can interpret texts. And so every single question presents a different type of text and encourages you to approach that text and to understand it and to deliver an answer that shows your comprehension, your understanding and your interpretation of that text. So that's really important to keep in mind. So what's really nice about English is that we know exactly that there's going to be 5 questions. We know the mark allocations, and so we can prepare ahead of time. And I specifically like to prepare in terms of my time management, because I know once I'm in the exam, I can get carried away and start talking about, maybe spending too much time on a comprehension or too much time on a summary. So over here, I'm going to detail for you how I would recommend that you allocate your time. Obviously, everyone is absolutely different, and so hopefully when you are preparing for paper 1, you have done some past papers and you've tested out how long you take on each section. So this is just sort of how I would advise it. So question 1 is your comprehension, is 30 marks, so that is a big chunk of the paper. So I would definitely allocate a large chunk of time to that, for example 50 minutes, because you're going to have to be reading that comprehension, which is often 2 pages long, and you're going to have to be answering quite a few questions, including a lot of 3-marker questions and even a 4-marker at the end. Then you have your summary, that's for 10 marks. I would spend around 15 minutes on the summary. Then you have your advertisement, which is 10 marks. I would spend around 15 to 20 minutes on your advert. And then question 4 is your cartoon. I would also spend around 20 minutes on that for 10 marks. And then question 5 is your language, which is 10 marks, but I would just spend 10 minutes on this because it is a relatively simple section compared to the others, in the sense that you don't have to write out full sentences as your answers. And then you have 5 minutes as checking time. So this is just a guide, just a reference point. I just want you to keep in mind when you are writing your exam not to overspend time on certain sections, but to make sure that you answer all of the questions, because that's going to give you the best chance of success. So let's just chat about some theory that you need to study. I think there's a very common misconception about English in general, and specifically English paper 1, that you do not have to study for it, and that cannot be farther from the truth. There is a lot of theory to study, especially for paper 1. Things such as punctuation, sentence types, writing styles, register, types of contradiction, diction, tone, mood, intentional purpose, theme and message, pronouns. These are just a few things that you really need to be familiar with and you need to study. And if you go through past papers, you will see the recurrence of these theoretical type questions that come into the fold. So please remember to go look at your English textbooks, to go look at your English notes from school, and to study this theory, because it can come up in any of the questions in English paper 1. So I want to sort of take a little bit of a deep dive into all the different sections and give you a little bit of understanding of what your mark is looking for in the section and how you can approach it. So firstly, in the comprehension section, as we spoke about earlier, it is a big chunk. It is 30 marks. I have made a video about how to answer comprehension, so I hope that you found that video and that you found it helpful. The big advice that I would give with comprehension is to read it through during your reading time and try and focus on understanding the main message or the fundamental theme of the text. I think oftentimes we get caught up in the details and we start looking at the counter arguments, we start looking at the examples, and we sort of obsess over those things instead of understanding what the main message of the writer is. Now that main message is so important because that is what is leading the writer into using certain stylistic techniques, into positioning the reader to believe something in a certain way. And so understanding what the main message is going to keep you focused in terms of what you need to be looking out for in the text, but also keeping you focused when you answer the questions, because you know that the use of pronouns that they're talking about has to do with the main message, or the use of diction in this paragraph is trying to emphasize the main message. So keep that main message in mind the whole time. Secondly, answering techniques, which links with the third thing over here on this list, which is mark allocations. So I would definitely advise the 1 sentence per mark strategy. I feel like in this way you are definitely going to get your marks, because you're going to focus on providing at least 1 point per sentence. With your answering techniques, I would encourage you to use the question paper. So circle the keywords of the question and use those questions in those words from the question in your answer to guide your answers, that you stay on track. So often what happens is that students get distracted, especially if it's a topic that they know. Maybe the comprehension topic is on a topic that you are passionate about, and then you'll start writing stuff, but it's actually irrelevant to what the question has specifically asked you. So circle the keywords in the question so that you stay on track with your answer and you don't get carried away. Remember that those different things that you've circled, those are going to give you your marks. So for instance, if they ask you, explain the diction in paragraph 5, you need to circle the word diction, and you need to circle the word explain, and you should probably underline paragraph 5, because then you have to go and search for diction. And if this is a 3-mark question, then you'd see, oh, but there's only 2 things I'm answering. I'm answering diction and I'm answering explain. Let me provide 2 pieces of diction and explain those 2 pieces of diction, and then I have a sentence where I comment on it when I explain the effectiveness of it. The marker in comprehension is testing whether you have comprehended the information. And so therefore, if you look at any memo of any paper 1 paper, you will see a lot of reference to lifting, and you will see that there is a specific instruction to your marker to take off marks or to not award full marks if the student has lifted from the paper, from the text. Meaning that you need to try and write in your own words, because if you're just going to copy the words from the text, the marker cannot give you the marks that you probably deserve if you understood the text, because you haven't shown them that you have understood it. So remember, you can't be there to explain to your marker that you understood it. You need to show that in your writing. So by using your own words, that is going to ensure that your marker understands, oh, she has interpreted this question correctly, she has interpreted the question, and she's given a proper answer, she knows what the text is about, and she's highlighted the particular aspect of the text which is important, therefore I can award her her mark. So keep that in mind the whole time. Is my answer showing the marker that I have understood the text and that I have understood the intention of the question? Obviously, there is a time and place for quotes from the text, but when you quote, you must always explain your quote. The next thing I've put here is theory versus content or practical application. So when you're reading your question, you need to be analyzing your question. I feel like sometimes people rush and they just read the question and they immediately start answering it. I'd recommend you look at your question closely and you try and decipher, what's the marker testing? What's the mark allocation? How do they want me to answer this? And specifically, is this a theory question, or is this a practical question, or is it a combination? So if it's a theory question, this would be like a language question, which sometimes can crop up in comprehension, like, why has the parentheses been used? That would be an example of theory. That is just clearly a reference to, have you studied, do you know what parentheses does? Then you have your purely content or practical application questions, meaning what does the writer mean by, and then they give you a quote from the text, and you just have to explain what that is. More often than not, your 3-mark questions are a combination of theory and practical. A lot of past papers I've looked at recently have spoken about this, or have had this question of explain the paradox, and that is a very typical example of a theory and practical application question combined into one. In that answer, you need to show your marker that you know the theory of what a paradox is, that you know it's a form of contradiction. And then you also need to practically apply it to the comprehension and show how the paradox is featured in this comprehension and explain its relevance. My tip to you is don't ever just answer a theory question in comprehension. Always apply a little bit of practical application, even if it seems like a theory question. Because in comprehension, it is mainly practical application questions, or those 3 markers are usually theory and practical together. The purely theory questions are going to come up in question 5 in language. Then the last question of your comprehension is always the intertextual question that's worth 4 marks. And here you have 2 texts. You have text A and then you have a visual text, text B. When you answer this question, I would always advise that you write down evidence from text A and that you explain the evidence, that you write down evidence from text B, explain the evidence, and then last sentence you can comment on it, whether you agree or disagree, do they support each other, do they contradict each other. So that's the structure that I would advise. As I say, I have a whole video on this on comprehension, so I really would advise that you watch that if you have not already. Question 2 is summary. Now, I want to just put in your heads that summary is slightly different from all the other questions that are asked in paper 1, because when you answer a typical paper 1 question, like in comprehension or advertising or cartoons, you are writing in full sentences, and it does matter that it makes sense, but summary is a bit more of a writing exercise, and so you really do have to focus on making sure that your writing is fluent, that your language and grammar is top notch, and that it really shows a sort of focused and formal style of writing. So it's the only question in paper 1 where I'd really say concentrate on, obviously always concentrate on how you get your ideas across, that's really important, but this is the only time you have to do it in a sort of a long form way, like you would do in a literature essay in paper 2 or your essay in transactionals in paper 3, because your summary is typically 90 words, so it is probably longer than the questions that you are answering. In questions 1, 3, and 4. With a summary, I would definitely advise that you read your question carefully, because your question tells you the focus, and that's going to allow you to only focus and include relevant points in your answer. So remember that the text that they give you for a summary has some relevant points, but it also has some completely irrelevant facts in there that they put in there to see if you're really reading the question and if you're only going to include the relevant information, and they're only going to award you marks for that relevant information. Remember to take your summary, the text that you're given, and to highlight what the points are. You have to have 7 points to achieve the 7 content marks up for grabs in summary. And this is really a simple, easy 7 marks that I would say that anyone is capable of getting those 7 marks for summary, for getting 7 points from the text. The biggest reason why people don't get these marks is because, firstly, they don't count their points, so they don't realize that they don't have 7 points for the marker to give 7 marks to. And also what they might do is they might get carried away and start using their own ideas, and that is strictly forbidden in this question. You have to use your own words, so don't just lift the words from the text. Once again, do you see how that links to the marker's intention for this whole paper? How have you interpreted the information, or have you comprehended the information? So if you're just copying, none of those skills are being shown off, therefore you're not going to get your marks. So make sure that you count your points and that you only include points that are in the text using your own words. A little tip as well, obviously you can be using synonyms to change the way the points sound. You can also change the sentence structure, and also another tip is, typically when we see a line, when we see a sentence, we struggle to put in our own words. So why don't you read the sentence, understand the main point, cover it up with your hand, and then try and figure out, okay, how can I say this in my own words? So when you're not looking directly at it, once you've written it, go back, lift up your hand and check that you have delivered the same piece of information and it's not just your own ideas, but you'll see it's automatically in a different word form. The words are different. Word count is really important. Read your instructions carefully and make sure you put the word count there. It should really be between 87 and 90 words. Do not go over, because you will be penalized. Fluency is really important. As I said earlier, it needs to really flow, because those extra 3 marks, so 7 points are for content and then 3 marks are for your language and grammar. So make sure your punctuation is spot on. Make sure you're using advanced diction. Question 3 is the advertisement. And the advertisement, I would say, out of question 3 and 4, it's typically easier to analyze an advert than a cartoon. Not to say that cartoons are difficult, but adverts are typically quite simple because of the fact that their intention is very clear always. It is always to persuade the reader to buy a certain product. So even if it comes across as being philosophical or emotional, you must remember that the underlying reason for why that advertisement has been published is to persuade readers to buy a product. And so therefore you need to be aware of the advertising techniques involved. So you need to have a look for the visual and the verbal clues, techniques, or hints. Bold capital letters, for instance, are going to try and attract readers' attention. You might also see, a picture of a happy person enjoying the product. That's also going to be a technique that's going to try and persuade readers to buy a certain product. If they use emotive diction, then those sort of, words that make you feel emotions and make you feel certain things, that is trying to get you to buy the product. So everything is trying to propel you to buy this product. So just keep that in mind the whole time. And then you can analyze the visual and verbal techniques in that context. Remember, visual techniques have to do with the image that you see, the body language, the facial expressions, the color, the proportions, things like that. And with visual, you have to be very specific in your answer when you're providing a visual clue. So you can't just say, oh, the boy looks sad. Rather, you need to say, the boy's facial expression shows a tear coming down his cheek, therefore he is sad. Verbal clues, this has got to do with the actual writing in the advertisement. So this can do the slogan, it can refer to the body copy. And here we can use our sort of comprehension techniques to analyze the sentence structure. Perhaps, is it using the imperative? Is it commanding us on what to do? Or does it use emotive diction, for instance? And here you can quote it and you can explain it. Keep in mind your answering techniques that we discussed in comprehension with the mark allocations. Same idea. 2 marks, 2 sentences, 3 marks, 3 sentences. Question 4, we're looking at cartoons. So firstly, there is a bit of study involved before we can even answer questions on cartoons. You need to study your techniques of humor. So you need to know terminology such as irony, juxtaposition. I suppose juxtaposition is not humor, but you need to know irony, puns, sarcasm, satire. These are all techniques of humor. These are ways that humor is communicated by the cartoonist. Remember that a cartoon can have 2 intentions. So firstly, it could be used to entertain us, and we have those cartoons that you see come up in past papers where they're just purely funny and they're entertaining. But then you also have more serious cartoons where they inform or educate us about a particular issue. And these are usually your satirical cartoons where they mock a serious situation in order to draw attention to it. So with a cartoon, the same visual and verbal techniques that you looked for in an advert, you need to look for in a cartoon. They're just going to have a different effect in this case. So like an advert, maybe bold lettering can attract the reader's attention. In a cartoon, the bold lettering is going to maybe signify someone is angry or that they're shouting. And then remember your answering techniques once again, using the mark allocations to guide you, using the words of the question to guide you, and not getting carried away in going against the question, really focusing on answering the specifics of the question. And lastly, my favorite question in the whole paper is the language question. I think that this is such a wonderful question because there's so much you can do to prepare for it. There's so many terms you can study. There's a lot of theory you can study. But I know that a lot of people do struggle with this section and don't have the confidence to attack it with the vigor it deserves. And I think that that's a real shame. So my advice is definitely to study the terminology and the theory that you need, the functions of the punctuation marks, concord errors, malapropisms, and to give every single question a go. Don't leave anything out. The trick with this section is that you have to look at everything in context. So they give you that text, and I want you to actually think of it as a positive thing, because they're not just randomly asking you what's the function of a hyphen. They're giving you an example in context. So you can go back and read the sentence, and you can even figure out in that moment what the hyphen is being used for. So I think that that's something that you should sort of change in your headspace if you do typically view this section negatively, in terms of that the context really helps you understand what the language errors are in terms of figuring them out and correcting them. Look out for the main suspects. If you do a lot of past papers, you'll notice that they tend to repeat the questions that are asked, and in every single paper there's typically a concord error. There's probably some sort of apostrophe or comma error going on. So always just keep those ones at the top of in the front of your head so that you can take them out when you need to. And when it comes to a grammatical error, you sort of go through a little list in your head on all the possible grammatical errors that there could be. The next thing is read the question really carefully. Do they ask you to identify something, or do they ask you to correct it? These are very different instructions. If they ask you to identify an error, it means you need to actually just take that error and write it down. If they ask you to correct the error, then you probably need to take what the error was, write down what the error was, and show the corrected version, rewrite the sentence with the correct version. So also just know the difference between the different kinds of language questions they can ask you. Sometimes they'll give you the specific name of a language question or of a language error, like they'll say Malapropism or Misrelated participle or concord error, and that involves you going back to your text and actually finding that concord error in the correct paragraph or in the paragraph that they've assigned you. However, you also have those questions where they actually just quote the sentence and they say correct the error. So just keep in mind those two sorts of levels of questions, and that's why you do need to be familiar with the terminology. In case they ask you to find the concord error, you need to be able to find it. But when you're having a look at the sentence that they've quoted, you can also think to yourself of the same sort of things. Okay, let me see, is there a concord error? Remember that sometimes you're going to have to add words in order for something to make sense, in order to correct the error, which is perfectly fine and perfectly reasonable, and you have to do that to get your marks, right? For a misrelated participle, for instance, you do have to add a subject and a finite verb. However, remember, don't add too much. You always just add what is necessary. You don't change the meaning of the sentence unless they have specifically asked you to. So just some general tips that I would advise in your study process for paper 1 is definitely to download past papers. Thankfully, the DBE website is full of past papers from many years, and it has all the marking guidelines attached, and that's really wonderful. Because this is such a skills-based paper, past papers cannot be, the value of past papers seriously must not be underestimated, because it's the more you practice, the better you're going to become at analyzing these texts. And also your exposure to all the different types of questions that they can ask is certainly going to be helpful, so that when you're actually in the exam, it's going to be a different text, obviously, but the same sort of questions. You're not going to be surprised by the way they phrase the questions. Furthermore, you'll also know what the markers are expecting, so have a look at that memo, see what they're asking for, and when you mark your work, obviously, and you can see then, you know what the markers are wanting, and you know also how to take your ideas and take your interpretation and put it into words. That is a skill, so it requires practice. The next important thing is to study the theory. As I said earlier, English paper 1, one of the biggest misconceptions is there's not a lot to study. There is. Definitely go and study your language, study the things that come up in comprehension, make sure you know that terminology so that you can apply it to the text and to the themes that are being discussed in those particular texts. Your mindset in the examination is so important, especially for this paper. I would argue for every single paper that you write, your mindset is important, but especially for English paper 1. Because if you haven't had a good night's rest, if you're feeling really negatively and you really are not in a good mood, then your marks are really going to suffer. Because in an English paper 1 exam, you don't have access to any of these texts beforehand. You are seeing these texts for the very first time, and therefore you have to be wide awake and you have to be able to think critically in the exam. You are reading a text, you're going to have to see, okay, that's that technique that over there, or this is what his argument is suggesting, or this is what they're trying to advertise to me, or this is the concord error. You're constantly thinking. It's not like when you do perhaps even English paper 2 where you have studied your poetry and you know your poetry, and obviously I'm not going to say you don't have to think in paper 2, you definitely do, but English paper 1, you've never seen these texts before, so you really have to be thinking critically on another level. So make sure your mindset is optimistic, is focused, and is that you're concentrating really hard, and that you're in the correct mindset to attack the examination properly. Focus on the intention. So I did mention this throughout the video actually. So what I mean by this is focus on the intentions of the text. So when you're doing comprehension, understand what the intention of a comprehension is. Understand what the intention of the marker is in terms of asking you these questions. When you switch to advertising, there's a different intention behind that advert. There's also a slightly different, although similar, intention of the marker when asking you the questions. The same applies to cartoons. I mean, if you think about summary, for instance, as we spoke about, this is a completely different intention, a completely different set of skills that you're being asked to do. So as you switch questions, and even question 5 for that matter, as you switch questions, think about what I've said about each question and change your headspace and change how you're thinking about it, because the intentions of each of those texts and the intentions of your marker in asking you each of those questions is different. The last thing I want to say is always try. I find it so heartbreaking when I mark papers where students just don't even attempt a question because they don't have the confidence, they don't believe that they can do it. Especially if you're watching this and you're about to write your final exam, definitely just give it a go. There's no harm in trying, and the beauty of English is that there's very rarely one singularly correct answer, except for question 5, right? Comprehension, summary, advertising, cartoons, there are many different interpretations, and so if you feel like you've interpreted something but it sounds strange to you, don't worry about it. It might really be strange. Write it down. Give yourself the chance to actually score some marks. And the big thing with English is if you're going to say something, approach every single question or every single answer as though it's a little argument that you're having, that you're trying to prove to your marker that you understand something. And you want to prove your interpretation of the cartoon or of the advert. So when you try a question, don't try it half-heartedly. Give it 100% effort and really explain what your reasoning was and what your thinking was behind coming up with this interpretation. So bottom line, read every question, analyze the question, and give it your best shot. I would definitely say in terms of exam techniques, if you don't understand a question, circle it, and you feel like, maybe you're not going to answer it, it's not going to be your best answer possible, circle the question and come back to it at the end, because you don't want to waste time working on something that you may not get the right answer to. Rather ensure that you get all the marks that you know you're going to be good at. However, you must come back to it at the end of the paper and you must attempt it. You must try it, because I think you'll surprise yourself. You might just score a mark or 2. And I also wanted to mention, I did advise your different timings at the beginning of the video for each question. Remember that that's not a hard and fast rule, so you need to tailor it to what suits you. But another thing that you can do is you can always start with the question, with the section that you know you're going to get the most marks for. So, for instance, if I was writing this exam, I would definitely start with question 5 because I feel like that's my strongest section. I could get a nice 10 easy marks in the bag. So, think to yourself, okay, is my strength comprehension? Is my strength advertising? Is my strength language? And maybe start with that question, just a thing to think about. Maybe to start with that question so you get some marks in the bag. However, bearing that in mind, I would never do the comprehension last. I know some people really struggle with comprehension, but because it's such a big section, because it's worth 30 marks, you can't leave it to the end when you're tired. So do it as one of the first things. Definitely, you got to tackle that comprehension. I hope that you found this video helpful and it just gave you some sort of idea of how to approach the exam and maybe a few tips and tricks. Wishing you the best of luck. Be confident, be optimistic. You've got this. Remember to explain yourself and to stay focused as you're answering every single question. Good luck. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be unpacking some skills regarding the section of comprehension in your exam, and we're also going to take a look at some past paper questions and see how these skills actually help in a practical exam. So, firstly, what should we be aware of when we are approaching a comprehension? Well, we need to be thinking of what is the marker testing and what is the marker looking for in the answers. If you step into the marker's shoes when you are answering your comprehension questions, it's really going to be to your advantage because you're going to see where the marker wants to allocate the marks and whether you've met that criteria. You should also be aware of your mark allocations. If it's 3 marks, if it's 2 marks, that needs to guide your answer, it needs to guide your explanation. You also need to be aware of whether you should be writing in your own words or whether you should be using quotes based on the cues in the question. And then you also need to be aware of whether you need to be using your own opinions or the information from the text. And usually for comprehension, they are looking at the information from the text, because the idea behind comprehension, what the mark is looking for is, has the student comprehended the information that has been given? So you have to be very careful not to state your own opinion when they're asking you a textual question. And often there's just one or two questions towards the end of the section where they ask your opinion, but your opinion is also based on what you've read in the text. So what you should think about before actually answering your questions. You need to be thinking back to those mark allocations, and you need to decide, how many facts do I need in this question to get the full amount of allocated marks? I need to be thinking, what are the key words in the question? I should also be thinking, which paragraph does the question refer to? And they often put that in the question, but sometimes we ignore it and we forget that they've told us to refer to paragraph 2, and then we explain something from paragraph 3. So before you answer the question, just make sure that you've looked and you've double checked that you're looking in the right paragraph. And then you also need to be thinking, what is the question word being used? Did they ask how, or did they ask why, or did they ask evaluate, or did they ask assess, or did they ask determine? All of these different words have different meanings, and they require different styles of answers. So what should you actually write? And we're going to go through this in the next slide in more detail, but just some general things to think about. Use the words of the question to guide your answer. Write according to the mark allocation. Always write in full sentences, especially in comprehension. Remember, your marker is an English teacher. They're going to appreciate full sentences. You want to mark so that they're happy with the answer and they want to give you the marks that you deserve. And the last thing is, imagine you are writing to someone who has not seen the question paper or the text. So imagine that your marker is looking at your answer book and they are sort of blind to what the text actually says and what the question is. And by the end of reading your answer, it must be clear to them what the question was and what the text was about based on your answer. So that's something like a little trick to think about, is if you've answered the question properly, then it's going to be very clear if your answer reflects what the question originally was. So here is my recommendation. Now, obviously, different people approach comprehensions in different ways, and so if you found a way that works for you, go for it. If you're struggling to, find that approach, then hopefully this can help you. So the first thing I would do when getting my comprehension is, for me, during reading time, I would read my comprehension. I would try and get a general idea of what it's about. And then when I go to my questions, before I answer my questions, I need to make sure that my question paper is full of highlighting and full of circling, because I need to see, well, for me, I need to engage with the question before I can actually answer it properly. So my advice would be to go and circle or highlight the keywords in the question and break it down into mini questions. And I'm going to show you that in an example on the next slide. But you break down, especially those 3 and 4 mark questions, they can sometimes be overwhelming. So circle your keywords. What are they asking? Decide what they are asking in the question and break it down into little pieces that you can answer. Use the words of the question to guide your answer. So this links back to what I said on the previous slide regarding making sure that through your answer the question is understood. So if the question says, how is the message conveyed through the diction? You use the words of the question. You can say, the message is da-da-da-da, the diction is da-da-da-da. This is not an essay. This is an exercise in comprehending the information and articulating the information. So if it's easier to use the words of the question and to guide the marker exactly where you're going with your response, then do that. You're not getting marks in comprehension for the fluency of your writing or the subtlety with which you use diction. You are getting the marks according to the facts that you're providing. Define each part of the question and provide evidence in the form of short quotes. So if you listen to what I've said in terms of using the words of the question to guide your answer, you're essentially going to be defining, in inverted commas, each part of the question. So if it says, how is the message conveyed through the diction? You are saying the message is, the diction is. You are defining each aspect of that question. And so then you're going to get your marks easily. Now, for a 3-mark question, it's sometimes quite nice to put a short quote in from the text to show that you are using the information from the text and you're not just coming up with your own ideas. But a very important thing is you don't want to just quote as your entire answer, because that is showing me absolutely nothing. It's not showing the marker that you've understood anything. So you need to provide a short quote, but then you need to explain your quotes using your own words, because the marker is looking to see whether you have comprehended the information. They're not looking to see if you can copy from the text. They're looking to see have you comprehended. So you can use a short quote, put it in inverted commas, but then make sure that you explain it. Take note of the mark allocations and write accordingly. If it's 2 marks, you want at least 2 sentences. 3 marks, 3 sentences. 4 marks, 4 to 5 sentences. This is very important in terms of some people are underwriters, so they will only write 1 sentence for 3 marks, and there's no possible way you can get 3 marks in 1 sentence. But it's also important for those overwriters out there, because if it's 2 marks and you're writing 4 sentences or 5 sentences, then you are going to run out of time. So you need to ensure that you contain yourself, and if it is only 2 marks, you only write 2, maximum 3 sentences, so that you can ensure that you complete the paper in time. Sometimes with the comprehension, people get fixated on the details, and they find a little detail or they find a word that they don't understand, and then they feel like they can't do any of the comprehension questions because, well, they don't understand that particular detail. My advice would be to understand what the main message and theme of the comprehension is. So take your reading time and read that comprehension once over, maybe twice over, and get in your head, what is the main message? What is the main theme of this? Is it about climate change? Is it for climate change? Is it against climate change? Just simple things like that. And that's going to keep you focused and on the lookout for how this message is being portrayed. And that's ultimately what the questions are going to be based around. Remember, there's typically maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs that go against this main message, and that's the counter argument. So look out for those. Is there a counter argument? Is there not a counter argument? But understanding the main message of the text, which hint can often be deduced from the title, is going to allow you to focus on the techniques and not on the details that maybe you don't understand. But focusing on the main message is going to help you answer the questions accurately. Always remember that a text is positioning you to believe something. And the ways in which they position you to believe something include things like pronoun usage, diction, sentence structure, paragraph lengths, punctuation. So always be aware that you are being manipulated. This refers to comprehensions and adverts and cartoons. They are always positioning you to believe something. So make sure you understand how they are positioning you to believe that main message or that main theme. When answering your questions, and this applies to comprehensions and visual literacy, which includes your advert and your cartoon, remember to combine the theory and the practical application. So for example, if they ask you what is the effect of the use of the rhetorical question, now that's a question that, you know, theoretically a rhetorical question always engages with the reader. So you write it engages with the reader, or it makes the reader think, but that's the theoretical part. You need to actually apply it to what's being spoken about in the text. So you need to say, the rhetorical question makes the reader think about the dangers of climate change. So once again, going back to that idea of the marker doesn't have the text in front of them, you need to ensure that when you have those theory questions, like what is the effect of the rhetorical question, that you combine your theoretical knowledge with the practical application to this particular text. Answer each part of the question and circle where the marks are coming from. So you circle your keywords in the question, and I'm going to show you an example and it's going to make more sense, but understand where your marks are coming from, and then you can answer these sorts of mini questions within this 3 or 4 mark framework. And from there you can put yourself in the marker's shoes and you can read back your answer and say, oh yes, okay, I am going to get 3 out of 3 because I've got 3 particular points. I've unpacked every part of the question. And then remember, whenever they ask you what is the effect of something, or what's the effectiveness, or to comment on the use of something, it's usually to emphasize. But you can't just say to emphasize. You need to be specific as to what it's emphasizing. So how is the diction used effectively? You would explain what the diction is, you define what the diction is, explain it, and you could say the diction emphasizes the tone of, and you actually have to be specific about what that tone is or the message of, and explain that message clearly. So on the screen here I have the questions from the November 2021 DBE grade 12 paper. So you can have a look, and I've got the links on the next slide where you can actually find the comprehension, the questions, and the memo. But I want to unpack the questions with you, and unfortunately the memo doesn't really show you exactly where each mark comes from in some of the cases. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but I want to show you how I would actually unpack each of these questions and how I would go about answering them. So I'm not actually going to answer them, I'm going to show you how to approach them, and then my advice would be to try to do the paper yourself, and then you can check if you're on the right track in terms of the content. So 1.1 said, what message does the writer convey in the first sentence for 2 marks? So I need to see, where am I going to get my 2 marks? Well, my first mark is going to be actually telling you something about the first sentence, and my second mark is going to come from the message. So this is something that could be put together, and maybe I could just find 2 different messages from the text, or I can explain the first sentence really well in my own words, and then tell the marker what the message is, what I've got from that first sentence, from the explanation, what the message is. And I can use the words of the question. The first sentence is about da-da-da-da. The message the writer conveys is da-da-da-da-da. And then I have 2 marks. So 2 marks for 2 sentences for unpacking 2 different aspects of the question. 1.2. What does trading playground insults reveal about the writer's attitude towards powerful politicians? So here you need to unpack what trading playground insults suggests, what it means, and then you need to actually define what the writer's attitude is. So is the attitude dismissive? Is it optimistic? You need to find an attitude word, and attitude is a synonym for tone, which means that you need to use an adjective to actually describe what this attitude might be. So unpack what trading playground insults, what a playground insult is, and then tell me what the writer's attitude is. And then you're going to get 2 marks. Refer to paragraph 2. Discuss the importance of mentioning the participants in various protests. So this is a pure content question. There's nothing theoretical about it. It's just based on your understanding. But go back to paragraph 2, because I said refer to paragraph 2, and please reread paragraph 2, and then you'll be able to answer this in an easier fashion, because paragraph 2 is actually going to explain this. So you need to unpack what it means that participants are in various protests, and then you need to say what the importance is. And so the importance here would probably be to emphasize something, to emphasize what the writer is trying to say. And so I would write there, the importance is to emphasize what the writer is trying to communicate in the message, which is, and I tell you the exact message of the text. 1.4, so here's our first 3-mark question. Refer to paragraphs 3 and 4. What are the implications of referring to humankind as a child and an adolescent? So this is a very important question to understand where the marks are coming from. So you need to first establish what it means to refer to something as a child and an adolescent. So maybe I would say a child and an adolescent would connote, yes, it would suggest, and I'd write a sentence about what it means to be a child and to be an adolescent. And then for 2 marks, I need to explain the implications of that in regard to humankind. But firstly, you have to unpack what a child and an adolescent, what that connotes, what that means, what that signifies. 1.5. How does the writer use diction in paragraph 5 to convey his message? So this is one of those questions that I think a lot of students dread, but I would actually say it's one of the best questions you can get, because it is something that comes up in every single paper, so you can be prepared for it. It's 3 marks, and it's quite simple in terms of how you need to unpack this. Firstly, you need to unpack the diction. Diction is the choice of words. So you need to go and find a single word or maximum 2 or 3 words. But really, diction is about the use of a particular word and the connotations, the implications of that particular word. You need to quote the word, and you need to explain what the connotations of the word are. What are the associated meanings of that word? You do that in your first sentence. And to be safe, I would do 2 words. I'd unpack 2 words. Then I would say in my next sentence, the message is, what is the writer's message in paragraph 5? And then lastly, how does the diction convey the message? I would say the diction conveys the message by emphasizing the something characteristic. And there's your 3 marks. 1.6. Comment on the writer's tone in paragraph 6 with close reference to the text. Alright, so this one is it's quite similar to 1.5. It's quite theoretical, but you have to apply to the practical. So over here, you need to define what the writer's tone is, and remember we said this is an adjective, so you need to say the writer's tone is conversational, or it is scathing, or it is optimistic, whatever it might be. And then it's that close reference to the text. Close reference to the text means you need to quote and explain from paragraph 6. So I would say what my tone was, then I would say what the close reference to the text is, and then I would make a comment about it. So I need to make a critical argument as to how this tone and the text link together. So I could use perhaps my favorite word, emphasize again. So I could say how this idea emphasizes the writer's tone, or the tone emphasizes this idea in this way. Skipping to 1.11, to what extent does text B reinforce the ideas expressed in paragraph 7 of text A, motivate your response? So this is an important one because this is our intertextual question, and you always are going to get an intertextual question for 4 marks at the end, and it links text A and text B together. Remember, they're not going to give you a text B that has nothing to do with text A. There is always a connection. So my advice would be always to show the connection, always to show the similarity, because there is going to be some sort of similarity between them. It might be a different take on the issue, but it's the same issue that's being expressed. You have to remember to unpack the 4 marks. So where are you going to get your 4 marks from? So firstly, I would unpack text B. So what is text B about for 1 mark? Then I would unpack paragraph 7 of text A and explain what that's all about. And make sure that those explanations link together. Then I would make sure to give at least something from text B, some quote or some mention of the picture. And the same with paragraph 7 of text A, some little quote with an explanation. I would, in my head, put half and half a mark and half a mark for each of those. And then my last mark would come from the motivation of my response. And here I have to give a logical reason as to why the one reinforces the other, why they support each other, why they are the same. I hope that has been helpful. It's just a little taste of my approach in terms of how to get through a comprehension, how to achieve in a comprehension. Remember, as much as comprehension is about the text itself and understanding the text, there is a lot of preparation that you can do in terms of, what is tone, what is juxtaposition, what is diction. So making sure you understand those terms before you go into the comprehension, before you go into the exam. Remember to trust your interpretation of the text and to trust your understanding of the questions, and most importantly, to ascertain where you're going to get your marks and go according to your mark allocations. I hope that has been helpful. I'll see you in the next video.
Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we are going to be talking about the summary question for DBE students, and the summary question comes up in your English Paper 1 as question 2. IEB students, this does not apply to you because your mark scheme for a summary is different, so please stay tuned for a separate video on that. So DBE students, let's get into some skills and approaches for your summary question. So as with all of these skills and approaches videos, it's important to understand what is the intention, what is the purpose, what is the marker looking for, what are we testing you on in this question. So we're looking at whether you understand a written text. Can you select relevant information from that text according to the question? Can you paraphrase the main ideas? Paraphrase meaning putting into your own words, rephrasing essentially. And can you present the ideas in a well-constructed and concise manner? So is there some sort of cohesion to the thought process behind how you've organized your paragraph? And is it concise? Does it fit the word limit? Is it shortened? Is it obviously brief, just as the word summary implies? So before you start writing your summary, what should you be thinking about? What should you be doing? As you know, if you've watched any of my other videos, I am a big believer in, especially paper 1, you're not just diving into actually writing. You make sure you have a little bit of a plan. You highlight keywords of the question. So for summary, we're going to follow the same sort of idea. So obviously we're going to read our instructions very carefully. And for summary, it's extra important to read these instructions carefully because there are slight variations. Now, usually they're going to ask you for a paragraph. Usually it's going to be 7 points, and usually it's going to be a 90 word count. However, sometimes they do change it up a little bit. Sometimes it's bullet points. Sometimes it could be a different word count. Right now, this doesn't often happen, but it's important to read through those questions really carefully, highlight them. Sometimes maybe they want a title, sometimes they don't. So just have a read through those questions, those instructions really, really carefully so you don't make any silly errors. The next thing is to highlight the question or the topic of the summary. So it's never just going to be summarize the text. They're never just going to ask you that. It's going to be more of a specifically or a targeted question. They'll give you a text with a particular topic, but that text is going to include information that's not just about the topic of your summary. So for example, this is a really easy example, but it's a nice one to put in your head. You get a text about the advantages and disadvantages of video games. All right. And so in that text, that writer is going to explore both sides. But then if you actually look at your topic might say, explain why it is a good idea for parents to let their children play video games. So there, do you see how your focus is now different to what the writer's focus in that text was? You're going to be using the text ideas, but you have to focus on only the advantages. So highlight the question, the topic of the summary, and break it down. Try to understand it. A nice way to break it down is try to think of some synonyms perhaps for what's being said. The next thing you do is you read through the text. So have a read of it first, get it in your head what is going on. And now that you've highlighted the question and you have an idea of what's going on in the text, you take your highlighter, you take your pen, and you underline 7 key points, because usually they're going to ask you for 7 points in your instructions, all right? And you have 7 content marks. We're going to talk about the mark scheme a little bit later, but so you're going to go ahead and highlight 7 key points. Now, when we talk about actually writing summary, we're going to talk about things we're going to avoid in our points, but try and find 7 distinctive points. What distinctive means is that they shouldn't be too similar to one another. They should be very obvious to your marker that this is a separate point to the next point. So have a read through the whole thing and find your 7 points, and make sure that your points are answering the question of the topic. So that if, for example, that video game example, we're not highlighting a disadvantage when the question has been about advantages. So focus on the most relevant points, and you can always go in a different order. If you find the most relevant point, like as you're reading, it's in the middle, then highlight that, and then you can go back to the introduction. Oh, you missed that part. So that's what's really nice about not just getting into writing, is that you're not just rushing it and you're not just starting with the first point that you see. You're taking your time over here, highlighting those 7 points and making sure they're all relevant. You can go in any order. And the last thing is to number your points, which sort of links, because a nice thing to do, well, one of the big things with summary is that you need to try and put your own spin on it, but using obviously the text ideas. So something you can do is you can mess around the order of the points. So even if you've highlighted them and you've got 1 in each paragraph, for instance, you don't have to follow, okay, that was the first point they made, so I have to also make that my first point. You need to just make it logical, something that makes sense to you. So I would advise that you actually mix up the order, so number them. So maybe the first thing you highlighted in the first paragraph, you're going to make that number 4. So literally write a little number 4 on your question paper, so that you do that as your 4th point. And what I really like about this is it's a really easy way to fool your brain into making sure that you don't just copy and paste from the text, because we really don't want you to copy and paste from the text, because if you think back to the intention, that's not the intention of what a summary is all about, right? That's not what your marker is looking for. We know that you can write. Yes, we're not testing you. Can you just copy from the question paper into the answer book? So numbering your points in a slightly different way to what they've presented it as is going to force you, is going to sort of fool your brain into coming up with a slightly different way of presenting the information. So that's just a nice idea. You don't have to do that, obviously, but that's just a little tip that I think works quite well. So moving on to actually writing the summary now. And on the side over here, I've got this block, which is super important. And I would even write this down for certain students who sort of get carried away. because especially if it's a topic that you're interested in, it's so easy just to slip into talking about your own ideas about the topic. So let's say you're really passionate about video games and the example that I gave, and so now you're going to start rambling off about all the advantages, and it's really important that you don't. So you always need to focus in a summary on presenting the text ideas in your own words. So it sounds a little bit like contradictory at first, but I don't want any of your own ideas. I want the text ideas, but I don't want you to copy and paste the ideas. I want you to put them in your own words. But the very essence of the idea must be identical. So when you're actually writing the summary, make sure in order to make it concise, we want to make sure that we leave out all extra irrelevant information. So even if we have a relevant point, often in a long form piece of writing, there'll be an example, or there'll be a quote from a person explaining why this is important, or there might be a statistic. We want to leave that out. So we are only focusing on the key information. So even if it's a relevant example, we're not going to put an example in there. We're rather going to focus on conveying the fundamental point rather. Avoid repetition, that's pretty obvious, and long turns of phrase. What I mean by that is if there's a way to say something in one word, let's rather use the one word than maybe 3 words to say it. So instead of saying, it is therefore evident that, just say therefore, because it is therefore evident that. That sounds really lovely, but that is not going to work for a summary. That is way too many words to try and convey just the understanding of therefore. So really trying to be concise and succinct. This is crucial in a summary. Use your own words as far as possible. So obviously sometimes you can't use your own words, right? If it's video games we're talking about, there's not many other ways we can, say video games, right? So it's something to keep in mind. Obviously we can't, and your teachers and your markers are not expecting you to completely, reinvent the English language and find a completely different word or different phrase for video games. But you could say maybe online games, right? So just try your best to use what you have. So some different ways to try and use your own words or to make this summary your own is paraphrasing, so rephrasing it. And so taking the very essence, and a nice easy way to paraphrase is you read through the sentence, then you cover it with your hand and you try and think what was the main message, and then try and say it in your own words or try and write it down. So really this means to paraphrase properly, you really have to understand the essence of that sentence on a very deep level. So that's one thing that's really important. The next thing is synonyms, so using words that are similar. So this is especially good if you're maybe not 100% sure what the meaning of the word is, or not the word, but the sentence, right? Maybe you're not sure about the nuance of it. Using a synonym is really helpful. And what I like to do is, as I'm highlighting my points, as soon as a synonym comes to mind, I'll just write it down next to it. And that's really helpful because you can use that for paraphrasing, and you can also use it just, in sentence construction, like we're going to talk about afterwards. So synonyms, you can use it in a variety of different ways. And the next thing that I like to think about with trying to use my own words or make the summary my own, remember using the text ideas, but my own way of saying it, is sentence construction or organization. So if in the text it started with a subject, it's an active sentence, maybe I'll try to change it to a passive sentence. So I'll start with the object, or maybe, I'll start with the adverb with a comma. Yeah, so just really trying to figure out, okay, maybe I can manipulate the sentence and put a few of the words in different ways. And obviously, like I said, combining these 3 is really the key. So whether it's in alternate sentences, but even within one sentence, you can paraphrase a part of the sentence, provide a synonym, and change the organization of the sentence construction. So let's have a look at the mark allocation. I've taken this directly from last year's mark scheme. And so with this summary, you are marked out of 10. And it's actually a really, really amazing opportunity here, because for this summary, you can easily get 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. It is not, something that is too challenging. So your 7 marks are for your 7 points. So that's your content, right? That's picking out those relevant points. That is honestly super achievable. And then you have your 3 marks for language. That maybe could be a little bit more challenging for certain people, but still very doable, very manageable. So then you have this over here, which is really interesting to understand, is the distribution of language marks when you have been copying and pasting, right? So quoting verbatim means you've literally taken from the text and you've literally just written out exactly what the text has said. So if you want to get, a good result for your language part of it, it's important not to quote verbatim, because as you can see from this breakdown, you are going to lose the opportunity to get some marks if you're going to be quoting verbatim. So for instance, if you've quoted 6 to 7 quotations, so if everything's a quote, you're going to get absolutely no language marks. So you might get some content marks, but you're not going to get language marks. So it's important to use those synonyms, to paraphrase, and to alter that sentence construction. For the word count, you are required to give a word count. Now, it's interesting over here, they say they're not going to deduct any marks for not giving a word count, but markers are required to verify the number of words used. So it becomes really obvious when your marker is marking thousands or hundreds or even just a couple of summaries, how long 90 words is. So if they are assuming, or if they can see that it's beyond 90 words, they're instructed to actually stop at the 90-word mark. So it's important that you don't overwrite. I would always put my word count, just to follow all those instructions really clearly. So to break that down a little bit further, for your content, which is worth 7 marks, I'm looking for those relevant ideas, that you've answered the question, that is the text ideas, and that you have 7 clear points. My tip is, you don't have to do this, but my tip is to have always 7 sentences. I know some people will like to combine it using conjunctions, right? So using 2 different ideas in one sentence. My advice is always to just have 7 clear sentences, because then for your marker, you want to sort of make it the easiest possible thing for them to mark and to give you 7 points, right? 7 marks. So if you lay it out for them, 7 different sentences, it's going to be easy for that marker to see how those points have been divvied up. So that would be my suggestion. As I said, you can take it or leave it. For the language and grammar, we're really looking at own words. The own words really goes in content and language and grammar, but we saw from the mark scheme that you're going to lose marks if you don't get that own words in your language and grammar. So own words, critical. Sentence flow. So often when we're writing a summary, and especially under time pressure, right, I see that students they write a sentence and it actually doesn't make any sense. So make sure that once you've written a sentence, you go back and you read through, especially when you're editing so much, right, and you're scratching out words here and there. Sometimes the sentence doesn't actually flow, and then you're going to lose marks for that language part. So make sure that when you've written a sentence, go back, try reread it again, see if it makes sense, and then when you finish your whole summary, go back, read it from the top. Does it make sense altogether as a paragraph? Punctuation is important. So this is something with paper 1 that's interesting, is that for the other sections, when you're answering the short form questions, we're not looking too much at punctuation, at spelling, at things like that in paper 1, except for summary, because summary is you writing a paragraph, right? So unlike paper 2, obviously when you write your essay, paper 3 when you write your essay, we're obviously looking at spelling, punctuation, sentence construction. But when you answer short form questions, we're looking at the actual content more than anything. But for summary, it's sort of like an essay, in the sense I'm looking at content and I'm looking at language. And a nice thing to do as well is to use some connectives. So to maybe start, if you have words, right? If you have words at your disposal, to maybe start a sentence with furthermore, comma, or additionally, comma, just to sort of create this flow, or create this nice piece of writing to read, because sometimes the summary can be quite stilted. But that's for those students really aiming for that 10 out of 10, to include perhaps some connectives. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you found this video helpful, and that you now know how to approach that question 2 in paper 1. So please remember to like this video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.
Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be looking at the English paper 1 section of visual literacy, and we're going to be talking through some skills and approaches that you need to be aware of in order to effectively answer the questions on adverts and cartoons. So firstly, what you should be aware of going into the exam regarding your visual literacy section. So firstly, you need to think about, what is the marker testing? What is the marker looking for in my answers? And this is an important thing to consider for actually every section in English paper 1. You need to be aware of what the intention is behind that section and what the marker is trying to gauge based on how you answer.
So for visual literacy, the marker is testing, can the student analyze a visual text, which also has some verbal elements to it? Can they understand what the writer or the creator's intention is behind creating that text? And can they determine and understand how the techniques have been used effectively to convey that message? So keep that in mind as you are thinking about approaching a visual literacy question. Next thing you need to be aware of is mark allocations. These are so important. So it's a really simple thing, but we need to be aware if it's 2 marks, we need to have at least 2 points, 3 marks, at least 3 points, 4 marks, at least 4 points, and obviously the length of our answers is going to be determined by that mark allocation as well. Next, we need to understand our differences between visual and verbal clues and what those different clues can be. So what those potential options are. There's an endless list of what they could potentially be, and we don't know what you need to know because we don't know what that text is going to be given to you in the exam because it's an unseen text. But we're going to go on another slide coming up. We're going to go through some of the sort of main ones that come up, the main visual and verbal clues that come up. It's really important as well to know the difference between visual and verbal clues because sometimes you will get a question that is very specific. It asks you specifically only for visual clues, or some will only ask for verbal techniques, and then others will require an analysis of both of those techniques. And lastly, this is so important, you need to remember that the message is always connected to the techniques. So whatever techniques are being used in a particular text, in a particular visual text, it is always there to enhance or to convey or to emphasize the message being presented. So the message and the techniques are inextricably linked. So always keep that in mind when you are looking towards studying and writing a visual literacy question. So what should you think about before answering? Now, if you watch any of my videos, you know that the way I like to approach English Paper 1 is that you need to make sure that on your question paper you are highlighting, you are circling, so that you have a very clear idea of how you're going about every single answer. So even if it's a 2 or 3 mark question, you have a bit of a plan, a bit of a strategy going into it. So think about how many facts do I actually need, and that's going to be based on that mark allocation, right? So if it's 3 marks, you're going to need at least 3 facts. What are the keywords in the question? Do they ask me to discuss something? Do they ask me to evaluate? Do they ask me to determine which technique is better or which text is better? So circling or highlighting those keywords so we understand exactly what they are trying to get out of us from that question. And lastly, what is the writer or cartoonist's intention or message? So we spoke about it on the last slide, but this is something that's absolutely integral. And for me, when I'm doing a visual literacy question in an exam, I would have a look at my text, and that's the first thing I'm going to try and figure out is what is this writer trying to tell me? What is this cartoonist's message? And only from there, once I figure that out, then I can actually understand or actually turn to the questions and start to answer them once I have a clear understanding of what that writer's message is. So now we get to the really important part is what to actually write as part of your visual literacy responses. So firstly, you need to use the words of the question to guide your answer. This is going to make sure that you stay focused on the question, that you don't get sidelined, and that you ultimately fit the criteria of what the marker is looking for. So for example, if the question posed is, how does the writer use visual techniques to enhance his message? You will then can write as follows. The writer uses the visual clues of, and then you would actually, say what those visual clues are in order to convey the message of, and you can say what that message is. So using the words of the questions to guide you is really important. I think some students try and be creative and they try and put it all in their own words. And remember, this is English Paper 1, so we're testing on reading ability and evaluating abilities. So use the words of the question so that you can actually make sure that when your marker is marking, they can really easily tick off because you have answered each part of the question. Next is write according to the mark allocation. We've already discussed this. I like to use that rule of thumb of if it's 2 marks, at least 2 sentences, 3 marks, 3 sentences, etc. Write in full sentences. That one's pretty obvious, but also still an important one to remember, because this is going to make sure that your ideas are presented in a cohesive and academic way. The next one is imagine you are writing to someone who has not seen the text. So incorporate quotations and specific details into your analysis. So this is a little bit of a thinking tactic. Obviously, your marker does have access to the text, right? And they can see the advert or the cartoon that you're analyzing. But try and imagine that they don't have that and they don't have the question. And your answer then needs to be incredibly clear in terms of answering what the question is, but also in terms of providing evidence from the text to prove your particular opinion or your particular stance, what your answer is ultimately. So the rule I would say is that if they ask you for verbal quotes, if they ask you for verbal techniques, then to provide a short quote is a really good option, and then obviously to explain that quote. And then when they ask for visual clues, always give really specific details. So I always say to students, don't just say, oh, the boy looks sad. Don't even say the boy's facial expression is sad. Rather say the boy is really sad and depressed as we can see tears coming down his cheeks. So being really specific about what that evidence is to back up what your understanding of the message or the intention of the cartoon or advert is. Next is, what is the main message or theme? Keep this in mind the entire time you are writing on a particular text, because this is going to keep you focused and on the lookout for techniques. Like we said earlier, the techniques and the message are inextricably linked. So if you focus on what the message is, the techniques are going to become a lot clearer to you, and the intention of those techniques is also going to clarify itself. So keep your focus on what is the main message, what is the main theme, what is this writer trying to convey, and then all the techniques and everything else will be a lot easier to understand and easier to write about. So, as I promised earlier, let's go through a couple of the usual visual and verbal clues that seem to come up in visual literacy questions. So for visual clues, we can refer to body language. Like I said, though, we want to be super specific. So we don't want to just say, oh, the body language shows that they're depressed. We need to say they have hunched shoulders, talk about posture. Are they sitting or standing? We can also think about facial expressions. Are their eyebrows arched, wide eyes, etc.? The layout, think about what is in the foreground of this picture versus the background. What is the size disparity? Disparity means difference. So is something really big versus something really small? Is one word in particular really, in bold letters and bigger, stands out in comparison to other words? So think about size. Organization of the text as a whole. Font, so the style of writing, bold, italics, etc. I think a lot of people get confused with this one and think that it belongs under the verbal list, but it actually belongs under the visual list because it's about the visual of how the writing is presented, not about the words themselves. The words themselves are going to fall under verbal. Color, so colors as symbols, think about red could symbolize anger. You could also, if it's an advert, certain colors resonate with different brands. Logo, the image itself, does it invoke anything, any emotion? Is it associated with shock, with celebration, with joy? What is the emotion that is connected to that image? Verbal clues. So verbal clues, think about diction and emotive language, the choice of words, what are the connotations of the words that have been selected, what is the tone and mood that's generated from that diction, what punctuation has been used. Are there a lot of exclamation marks, really emphasizing emotion? Are there a lot of commas? Are they listing a whole bunch of different ideas or a whole bunch of benefits of a particular product? Pronouns, so first person pronouns, second person pronouns, third person pronouns, inclusive versus exclusive pronouns. So think about that and the effect that it can have within a particular context. Advertising or propaganda techniques. So do they use statistics? Do they use the bandwagon technique? Are they using particular jargon to cater to a particular target audience? Slogans, imperatives. Imperatives is when they start with the verb. It's almost commanding. It's like, buy this now. Sentence structure, simple sentences, compound, complex, loose or periodic sentences. But even just simply, is it a really short sentence, a really long sentence? Is it a combination of short sentences? And repetition. So let's look at advertisements or campaigns in a little bit more detail. So the intention of an advert, obviously every advert or campaign is going to have a slightly different intention, but the ultimate intention or the general intention that they sort of all circulate towards or center around is to persuade or convince the reader to purchase the product or service or to support the initiative. There's always going to be a certain target audience or market that you need to try and think about. So sometimes an advert's not really going to have much meaning to you, but maybe you're not the target audience, you're not the target market. Think about, okay, so who is this catering towards? Who would this interest? Why is this technique being used? Which audience is it hoping to attract? Don't lose sight of the intention within a layered advertisement. This is so important. Often advertisements, especially sort of modern or really clever advertisements, don't necessarily come across overtly as being an advert for a particular product. You could get carried away by the offering of a particular lifestyle that they have or a particular emotion that they're trying to sell you. So don't lose sight of actually the fact that they are trying to convince you to buy something. So even if it's showing this beautiful lifestyle, living in this mansion, remember, what are they trying to sell you? And they might be trying to sell you sort of just a simple product like orange juice, right? And they're just associating it with this incredible lifestyle. And obviously that is a propaganda technique, but there's so many of these different propaganda techniques that are often layered within a text, layered within an advert. So it's important, as much as what they're offering you, as much as what is being put out in that advert, always remember the singular intention of an advert is to persuade or convince the reader to buy something. Let's take a closer look at cartoons now. So the intention of a cartoon is to entertain, educate, or inform the audience. Now, in my mind, there's sort of two separate kinds of cartoons, and we know you could be asked either cartoon or a combination. So you have some cartoons that are supposed to just be funny. They're supposed to just be entertaining, light-hearted humor. And then we have other cartoons which are there to educate or inform the audience about something. Usually they use a technique called satire, which I suggest, if you don't know what that is, to refer to the techniques of humor video that I posted a couple of months ago. So think about those two types of cartoons. Firstly, try and identify, is this just a humorous cartoon? Is this just meant to be entertaining? Or is there an underlying message, something serious going on, which, yes, humor is being used in the cartoon, but they're also trying to educate the reader on something. And cartoons are one of the most biased and exaggerated texts out there. So always be aware of that. So cartoons are never objective. They're always subjective. It's always the cartoonist's perspective on a particular issue, especially with those more serious cartoons. So just constantly be aware of that when you're answering your questions. So this next slide is just pertinent to IEB students, so not applicable to those of you who are writing the DBE or the CAPS exams. So with IEB students, for your visual literacy, as part of your question 5 of paper 1, you get a whole bunch of adverts or a whole bunch of visual text to look at. Now, not always, but most of the time they tend to be related. So my advice is, when you're looking through your insert, try and figure out what is the overarching theme, what is the link between all these different visual texts. And once you understand that theme, then you go back and you try and look for what are the similarities and what are the differences in terms of the intention or in terms of the message or in terms of the techniques that are being used. Because sometimes they will present you with different texts, with different visuals, all about one issue, but maybe they have different perspectives on the issue. So they're going against each other in terms of intention, trying to convince us of the opposite thing. Or it could be the same intention, the same message, but they use different techniques to convince the reader of the same thing. So have a look at that. What is the thing that's linking all these texts together? And is there anything that I can pick up in terms of similarities and differences, in terms of the effectiveness of different techniques? And then when you get to those intertextual questions where they ask you to compare two texts or to contrast two texts or to decide which one is the most effective one, remember you need to reference both texts that are being asked about. So you need to use that short quote if you're referring to verbal details and explain it. You need to be specific about the visuals and explain them. So make sure you've referenced both texts before you get to that logical conclusion as to why the one is better than the other or why the one is more effective than the other, etc. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what other videos you would benefit from watching to prepare for your English exams. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be unpacking some techniques of humor. So techniques of humor are very important to know for any sort of advertising, cartoon, or visual literacy questions that you will get in English Paper 1. And what techniques of humor are, it is how humor is created. So it's these different ways in which something can be deemed funny or which is humorous. Now obviously there are many more techniques that we'll go through today, because this is just going to be a short video. We're going to talk about the main ones that tend to crop up in English exams, and we're going to understand firstly what they are, secondly how to answer questions on them, and thirdly I'm going to provide you with a little bit of an example so that you can see the techniques in practice. So let's get started. So our first technique of humor is a pun. A pun is a clever play on words. So it usually involves some sort of homophone pair or homonym pair, but not always. Remember that it can be a clever play on a certain word, but it can also be a play on a group of words. It's like, sort of like an idiomatic expression. So when you answer a pun question, always quote what the pun is. So quote the word that is being played on, and then explain the two potentially different meanings or interpretations of this word or phrase. So let's have a look at this example. I make horrible science puns, but only periodically. So in my answer here, to explain the pun, because they'll say explain the humor, then you'll have to say it's a pun on the word whatever, or they might say explain the pun, and then you'd say it's a clever play on the word. So I would say this pun is a play on the word periodically, and I'd quote periodically. In this instance, periodically can refer to the fact that this person makes science puns occasionally or sometimes. But the use of periodically can also refer to the periodic table, which is a scientific table which links to science puns. Here's our next example. I really like this example. What did the calculator say to the student? You can count on me. So here in my answer I would say, well, the pun is on the phrase you can count on me, or that's actually more of a sentence, and I would explain that the first meaning could mean that the calculator is saying that you can literally count numbers on it, but the figurative interpretation or the associated meaning, the other meaning is you can count on me, which means that the student can trust the calculator. Moving on, we have sarcasm. Sarcasm is when the opposite of what is said is meant with the intention to insult or mock someone. So in writing, we can often identify this when they use inverted commas. So obviously there's numerous reasons to use inverted commas, but when inverted commas are used, one of the things that you need to look out for is if it's being used to showcase a sarcasm. So in your answer, you always want to show the difference between what was said or written and what was actually meant, and how this is an insult to the person who it is directed towards. So if we have a look at this example from Friends, Joey says, "You didn't cry when Bambi's mother died," to which Chandler responds, "Yes, it was very sad when the guy stopped drawing the deer." So this is very funny interaction, right? It is quite humorous. We can see why sarcasm is a technique of humor, but you can see that what Chandler says literally is, he's not being offensive at all. He's saying it's very sad when the guy stopped drawing the deer, but we can understand that he's actually meaning the opposite of what he's saying. He is actually mocking Joey for being sad when the guy stopped drawing the deer and Bambi's mother died in the cartoon. The next one we need to look at is verbal irony. And this is very similar to sarcasm, so this is where I can get a little bit tricky. But verbal irony is when the opposite of what is said is meant. So when you say something but you mean the opposite. Do you see how sarcasm had this underlying intention of insulting someone, whereas verbal irony, that's not the case. So in your answer, you always have to show the difference between what is said or written versus what is actually meant. So you must say, well, this is what is said, but it is actually implied the opposite. This is a really good visual to understand the difference between verbal irony and sarcasm. So verbal irony, nice weather we're having. As you can see, she's being ironic because she's saying that there's nice weather and clearly it's really not nice weather. So she's meaning the opposite of what she says, but as you can see, she's not insulting anyone. And he responds, yeah, I might hit the beach later. Also an ironic comment on the weather. Whereas we have sarcasm, man, I'm soaked through my t-shirt. And then we have the sarcastic response, yeah, way to wear a raincoat, genius. So here he is insulting her by saying the opposite of what, by saying the opposite of what he means, or meaning the opposite of what he says. Another kind of irony which does crop up in visual literacy, and you don't really have to classify it as verbal irony or situational irony. They're typically not strict about that. But the reason why I'm classifying them differently here is that you can understand what to look out for. So you can look out for the words, the opposite of what they mean, but also for the situations. So situational irony is when the opposite of what is expected occurs. So in your answer, you always have to show, okay, this is what was expected to happen, and then use words such as however or but to indicate the opposite actually happened or something different to what expected occurred. So this is an example of situational irony. So what I would say in my answer here is this is ironic, and it creates humor because this is a fitness center or a gym, so it is expected that those who are going to the gym want to exercise and therefore would take the stairs. But instead, these people take the lazy option and they take the escalator up to the gym. Do you see how what we expected of the people is different to how they actually behaved? And lastly, satire. And satire comes at the end of the presentation because it combines a bunch of the different techniques that we've used with a specific intention. So satire is the use of wit, irony, and humor to mock a serious situation in order to draw attention to it. So in your answer, you always want to indicate that you've understood what the serious situation is and what technique of humor has been utilized. How has the humor been created to make fun of the serious situation? But always keep in mind that satire, the intention of satire is not just to make fun of a situation, but it's ultimately to draw attention to the severity of the issue in a unique way. So let's have a look at this example. We have here a sign. This is a shop, taxi spare parts. This is clearly a South African cartoon because it's about taxis, and we can see here what are the different supplies that are there. We have wire, string, glue, masking tape, scotch tape. And initially when we see this, we laugh because it's quite funny, because we're used to seeing taxis on the road with all these different makeshift repairs to the vehicles. And so initially it's quite funny, it's unexpected. Remember, humor usually comes from something that's unexpected. However, this is actually quite satirical because it's talking about a very serious situation, in the sense that if a taxi or a vehicle is not repaired properly, it actually causes real issues on the road, real safety issues. And we know that there are terrible instances of accidents, deaths, and injuries as a result of not fixing a vehicle properly. So do you see how it's alerting us to this serious situation, but at the same time it is, through humor ultimately. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to give the video a like if you enjoyed it and you found it beneficial, and to subscribe to the Tri-tutors YouTube channel. I'll see you in the next video.
Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the three main types of contrast that you need to be aware of when you are studying for your English exams. So the first one is juxtaposition, then we have paradox, then we have oxymoron. They're all forms of contradictions or contrasts, and we are going to have a look at what each of them is all about and some examples as well. So firstly, understanding what a contrast is in general. A contrast is when something is different from something else. So think about the colors black and white. They are contrasting colors. The one is dark, the one is light. And then we're going to get into some more technical definitions now with the three types or kinds of contrasts. So we have juxtaposition. Now juxtaposition, think about that word position. We are positioning two contrasting ideas next to each other. So for example, if we had a gym right next to a fast food restaurant, we are positioning two different ideas right next to each other. We've got a gym representing health and fitness, and then we've got a fast food restaurant representing unhealthy habits. So these are in contradiction. These ideas are contrasting and they're placed next to each other. Juxtaposition is also obviously evident in a text when you have two ideas that are contradictory or that are contrasting that are placed in subsequent paragraphs, for instance, or subsequent sentences. The next thing we need to talk about is a paradox. So a paradox is a seemingly contradictory statement that upon further reflection is seen to be true. So when you first read it, it sounds really obscure, really contradictory, really strange. But then the more you think about it, the more it actually makes sense. So a good example of that is less is more. That seems contradictory. How can less be more? They're literally the opposite. But then you think about it and you can think about it in terms of an example. Maybe wearing less jewelry sometimes makes more of a statement. So therefore, the sentence actually makes sense when you think about it on a deeper level. And lastly, we have oxymoron. An oxymoron is when you have two opposite words that are used right next to each other. For example, open secret, bittersweet, deafening silence. These are all opposite words and we've placed them right next to each other in a sentence. And this is actually a lot more common than we may think. I'm sure you've seen some of these examples beforehand. So I hope that you now feel comfortable when identifying different contrasts or contradictions in English texts. Thank you for watching this video. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be discussing a pronoun error, and we're also going to be discussing how to correct a pronoun error. So this is a section of work that you need to know for English Paper 1. You need to be able to know how to correct this error and also how to identify it within a text. So a pronoun error is similar to your subject-verb agreement error, but instead of dealing with subjects and verbs, we're now dealing with nouns and pronouns. So a pronoun error is when the pronoun doesn't match the noun that is replacing. The tip I have for you here is when you are looking for a pronoun error in a sentence, always go ahead and circle all the nouns and pronouns that you see, and then you can see whether they match up or not. The easiest way to explain the pronoun error is to give some examples. So on the next slide, let's go through some examples. These are all written in the correct form, and we're going to discuss what the common errors are that they try and trick you with, and then you know what the correct version is as well. So the first one, we have a look, and I've put all of the pronouns and nouns that are relevant in italics, and that's what you need to be doing when you're looking to identify this error and correct it. Always circle your nouns and your pronouns. We've got each student must bring his or her book to class. Now, the way we usually speak in everyday English language, we'd probably say each student must bring their book to class, but that's actually incorrect because each is singular, and so his or her is the correct and appropriate pronoun to include over there. He and I are going to the concert. Now that is correct. A lot of people in everyday language might say him and me, but that would be incorrect, and because me is supposed to be used as the object of the sentence, and here you are using I or yourself as the subject of the sentence, therefore it should be he and I. The girl who won the race received a medal. That is correct. The incorrect version, which often comes up, is the girl that won the race, but the girl is a person, and therefore it should be who and not that. If one has a dream, one must work hard to pursue it. They really catch people out here because they have separated those pronouns in different parts of the sentence. So often they'll have a sentence like, if one has a dream, you must work hard to pursue it. One and you are not aligned, so you can change it either to if you have a dream, you must work hard, or if one has a dream, one must work hard. They need to match. If people want to succeed, they must have a goal. Same sort of thing as the previous one. The way that markers often do it is they'll say, if people want to succeed, one must have a goal. But we're talking about people here, we're talking about plural, therefore the matching pronoun should be they. You must do your work to achieve your dreams. That is the correct version. Don't fall for it when they write in a sentence, you must work hard to achieve one's dreams, or you must work hard to achieve their dreams. It should be you and your. Those are the ones that are in alignment. So remember, the ones on the slide, these are the correct versions of those common errors and how we can correct them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be discussing direct and reported speech. We're going to be looking at what direct speech is, what indirect speech is, and then we're also going to be talking about how to convert different types of sentences and the different rules we need to remember when converting from direct speech to reported speech. So firstly, direct speech. What is direct speech? This is when we are conveying the exact words that someone has said in the moment, and we see that it's direct speech through the use of inverted commas or quotation marks. On the other hand, indirect speech or reported speech is when we're reporting what was said previously, and therefore there are no inverted commas or quotation marks. It's important to remember that when you are conveying something in the reported or indirect speech, it could be any amount of time after those words were actually spoken. And that's going to lead into the number of rules that we're going to have when we're converting from direct to indirect, because we could be reporting this after a month after the actual words were spoken. It could be years after the actual words were spoken. So we need to make sure that we follow certain parameters to ensure that direct speech correlates to the reported speech in terms of its essence and its meaning. So there are so many different ways to go about learning the rules for direct to indirect, and I've seen textbooks that really go in a lot of detail in terms of how you need to go about this transformation. And while those have a lot of value for English home language speakers, if English is your native language, we can often figure out the way something sounds, whether it has been correctly put in indirect speech from the original direct speech. The things that I found really help me when I am converting, instead of looking at all the different rules, just so like an overview of what I can think about when I'm converting, is 3 P's and an A, meaning I need to always remember to change up my punctuation. So direct speech to indirect speech, I need to remove inverted commas, colons, commas, capital letters, all that stuff. So I've got to adjust my punctuation. I've got to adjust my pronouns. If someone said something, then I need to then convey that he said it or she said it, and it's maybe not to you, but it's to another person, him or her. I always need to take whatever the sentence is and put it one step in the past. Like I said earlier, we don't know when this is being stated, when this indirect or this reported speech is being reported compared to that when it was initially said. So we always go one step in the past. So even whatever tense it's in, just always moving it one step back. And we've got to change our adverbs. It's usually adverbs of time, occasionally adverbs of place that we need to change. I do have a list of the most common ones that comes up at the end of the slides. So bearing that in mind, the 3 P's and an A, punctuation, pronouns, past tense, adverbs in every single type of sentence that we're going to be converting, let's unpack different kinds of sentences and the different words that we need to include to replace those inverted commas, so to speak. So if we have a look at the statement, we have Sarah said, I'm tired today. Just a note over here, whenever you're starting direct speech, you always include either a comma or a colon before you open your inverted commas, and you always want to make sure that your punctuation mark, whether it's exclamation mark, question mark, full stop, is always before you close the inverted commas. Sarah said, I am tired today. This is going to become Sarah said that she was tired that day. So we see a bunch of changes over here. We've got the that, which is being included. We've got the pronoun change of the I to she. We've got the past tense change from am to was. And we've got the adverb change of today to that day. Next, we have a question that starts with a question word. Sarah asked, "Where is the train?" That is going to now become Sarah asked where the train was. So we are removing those inverted commas. We are keeping the question word. We're changing to the past tense and we're changing the order of the sentence slightly, putting the verb at the end. Notice how for indirect or reported, we do not have a question mark because this is a question not being asked in real time. This is being reported days, weeks, months, years after the event has transpired, and therefore Sarah is not still asking where the train is. Moving on to questions starting with a verb. So Sarah asked, "Can I get a coffee?" This is going to become Sarah asked if she could get a coffee, or Sarah asked whether she could get a coffee. So notice your different questions. We had where is the train, starting with where, starting with the question word, but sometimes we have questions starting with a verb like can or may. So here we can either choose to use the word if or whether to help us bridge the gap between the direct and reported. Notice how we take can and we put it in one step in the past into could. We've changed the pronoun I to she, and we do not put the question mark in for the reported speech. Moving on to a command. So if we have Sarah yelled, "Students, do your work," we have two options of how we can convert this command into reported or indirect speech. We could say Sarah yelled that the students must do their work, or we could say Sarah yelled at the students to do their work. Either option is going to work, either using that and must or using to. As promised, here are some of the common adverbs that usually change. And they usually slip these into those questions where you're asked to convert from direct to indirect to see if you are paying attention. So now in the direct becomes then in the indirect. Today becomes that day. Tomorrow, the next day. Yesterday, the day before. Tonight, that night. Last night, the night before. Next week, the following week. Ago, before. And then the adverb of time, the adverb of place that usually changes here becomes there. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you found the video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's language-based video, we're going to be discussing the concepts of redundancy and tautology. Now, technically, these terms are different, but practically, the way they're asked in exam papers is quite similar. So we're going to briefly define each of these terms or these concepts, but then look at some examples together to understand just the concept of unnecessary repetition in general, because that's what's going to be important. That's the essence of this topic that you need to understand for your exam papers. So firstly, we have redundancy. Redundancy is the unnecessary repetition of information. This is an error. It's something that we shouldn't be doing in our writing. And so in English Paper 1, it's often our job, as posed by the question, to remove the redundancy within a paragraph or within a sentence. So we're removing that unnecessary repetition to make it grammatically more proper or more accurate. Tautology is similar but slightly different. It's saying the same thing in different words. So here the focus is more on the words itself. So here are some examples of unnecessary repetition. I saw it with my own eyes. Now this is an example of redundancy, but for the purposes of your exams, you can just understand it as being unnecessary repetition, whether the question asks for redundancy or for tautology. So what we need to do to correct it is we can just say, I saw it. We don't have to mention with my own eyes. Free gift. A gift is automatically free, so we can just call it a gift. End result. We can just say result because we know that a result is the end process of something. Adequate enough. Tautology. We don't need to say adequate enough. We can just say enough. Collaborate together. If we're collaborating, it's automatically together. Unexpected surprise, we can remove unexpected as surprise is automatically unexpected. So in essence, redundancy and tautology is all about removing that unnecessary repetition to avoid verbose sentences. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found that video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the misrelated participle error, sometimes known as the dangling participle error. This is something that you need to be aware of when you are writing in any English paper so that you avoid making this mistake, but it's also really important for your English paper 1 that you know how to identify this error and also to correct it. Sometimes it might be asked in the question, but more often than not, it's actually they just give you a sentence and they say correct the sentence, and it often tends to be a misrelated participle error that you then have to shift. So you may not have heard of the name before, but it's something that you have seen, I'm sure, in past papers where you have to add in a subject and a finite verb in order for the sentence to make sense. So let's get into it. So what is a misrelated participle? Well, misrelated participle is when you have a participle which unintentionally modifies the wrong noun in a sentence. So essentially, it's when you're using a participle and you don't have a subject attached to that participle, and so it lands up latching on to another noun in the sentence, but in terms of the meaning of the sentence, it's not supposed to. So for example, if we have the sentence, shrieking with pain, the sliver of glass was removed from her foot. Now, we sort of make sense of it in our heads and we understand, okay, there must be someone shrieking with pain. But if we look at the sentence, there actually isn't a subject linked to the word shrieking, linked to that participle shrieking. And so theoretically, that participle is going to attach itself to the closest noun, which is the sliver of glass. So it almost sounds like the sliver of glass was shrieking with pain, which obviously isn't what the intention of this statement is. So in order to correct it, we would need to add a subject and a verb. So we'd have to say she was shrieking with pain as the sliver of glass was removed from her foot in order for it to now make sense. Let's have a look at some other examples. This is the error followed by the correction. Walking down the street, the flowers were beautiful. It should be, walking down the street, I saw that the flowers were beautiful. Another error. Hoping to get a promotion, the office seemed more stressful than usual. It sounds like over here that the office is hoping to get a promotion, when it should be a person, so we need to correct it. So the corrected version would be, hoping to get a promotion, she felt the office was more stressful than usual. And our third example, our third error, jumping for joy the exam results were amazing, should rather be jumping for joy she celebrated the amazing exam results. I hope that you found that video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we are going to be looking at some of the functions of common punctuation marks. Now, this is an important video for you to be watching in terms of applying the functions of punctuation mark correctly in your writing, but it's also really important if you're studying for paper 1 because you often get those questions where you have to identify or figure out what the function of a particular punctuation mark is. So this is important for your own writing, but also when you're analyzing other people's writing, especially when you are answering questions paper 1. What is important to recognize is I'm going to go through some of the most common punctuation marks that they tend to ask questions about, but remember that there are a variety of functions for certain of these punctuation marks. So when you get a question in an exam paper, you always need to go back to the sentence, back to the text to see the punctuation mark and how it's used in context, because then you'll be able to identify which one of the functions of that particular punctuation mark has the writer intended to use here. So let's go through some of the most commonly asked punctuation functions. The first one is for inverted commas or quotation marks. There is a plethora of different reasons or functionalities of this particular punctuation mark. It could be used for direct speech, the exact words someone says. It could be used for sarcasm to indicate the opposite of what you're intending to say or the opposite of what you are actually writing. Book titles. Italics could also be used to show book titles, but sometimes inverted commas are used. Slang, foreign languages can also use italics, but sometimes they do use inverted commas. Next, we have a dash. A dash is used to show an explanation or an elaboration. You can see I've used dashes in all of my different bullet points over here because I'm showing an explanation of what the function of the particular punctuation mark is. Parenthesis. Now, parenthesis, that we have three kinds. This is brackets, double dashes, or double commas. So we can use any of those punctuation marks to indicate extra or additional information. A hyphen, that's the short line, and that's used to join two words to create a compound word. An apostrophe is used to show contraction, singular possession, or plural possession. This is one that people usually tend to, get wrong or use it mistakenly. So remember, an apostrophe is not to show possession. That is not what the function of an apostrophe is. An apostrophe is used to show contraction. So if you have I and am, you put it together, it becomes I'm, and you put the apostrophe where the missing letter is. Singular possession when something belongs to one person, or plural possession when something belongs to a group of people. A colon indicates the start of a list or an explanation. A comma is used to separate items on a list or to separate a main and subordinate clause. And the comma splice error is something that you definitely want to avoid, but also be able to identify when you are doing your textual editing or your language section. And that is when a comma is used to separate two main clauses. This should not be the case. What you need to replace that comma with is a full stop or a semicolon or even a coordinating conjunction. And the easy way to remember your coordinating conjunctions is using fanboys: for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. A semicolon joins two related main clauses, and an ellipsis shows missing information, and the effect is it can create some sense of suspense. Now, these are not all of the punctuation marks and not all the functions that could be asked. These are just the ones that come up the most often, so you should definitely be aware of them. As I said before, make sure if you're answering a paper 1 question, you always go back and look at the context in which these are being utilized, and then you can identify, especially for something like inverted commas, for instance. You don't want to just guess what it's being used for. You need to go back to the sentence that it's used in, go back to the context, and understand, okay, this writer has used it for indicating direct speech, or perhaps this writer has used it to indicate sarcasm. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found the video helpful. I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be examining the differences between acronyms and abbreviations. Now, this is a sort of question that can crop up in English Paper 1 in your language or textual editing section, so it's important that you know what these are and what the difference is between them. So firstly, an abbreviation. An abbreviation is a shortened form of a word. So for instance, saying prof instead of professor. An acronym is when you take the first letter of a group of words to create a new word that is pronounced as a word. And that's the key with an acronym, is that it's pronounced as a word. So for example, scuba, you take the first letter of self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, the first letter of each of those words, you've created a brand new word, scuba, which is pronounced as a word. And then lastly, we have an initialism, which is a type of abbreviation where you take the first letter of a group of words, but instead of pronouncing it as a word, you pronounce every single letter. So for example, SABC stands for the South African Broadcasting Company. So we take the first letter of South African Broadcasting Company of each of those words, and now we just say those letters in a row consecutively, SABC. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found that video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hi everyone and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video our topic is language, and we're specifically going to be looking at some common punctuation errors. This is not a video that we're going to go through where we're going to go through all the different punctuation marks. This video is about alerting you to some of the key punctuation marks that students mistakenly use or that they don't know the correct meaning for. This is a really important, language is a really important section, because not only is it the last question or the last section of paper 1 where you're asked to correct errors, to identify errors, to explain errors, but it's also important in any sort of writing that you do, whether it's essays, whether it's transactional writing, because often these punctuation marks are used inaccurately in that context, in the writing context, which can greatly minimize your chances of receiving that A or receiving that B according to the rubric, because you might score really high in your content, but then your language and your grammar and your style might score worse if you don't know how to use these punctuation marks effectively. So as I said, we're not going to cover all the different punctuation marks, just a few select ones that often give students problems. Alright, so we're going to start off with three, which are often confused all the time. We have a dash, a hyphen, and double dashes. A dash, the purpose of a dash, or the function, that's often how it's asked in an exam, is what is the function of the dash. The dash indicates an explanation or an elaboration. A hyphen is the shorter one, the shorter line. A hyphen joins two pre-existing words to create a compound noun or a compound adjective. And yes, a hyphen can have a different meaning or a different function in terms of, as you can see in the word pre-existing, helping that prefix along, but that's not something that's often tested in terms of when they ask you the function of a hyphen. It is 99.9% of the time about creating compound nouns or compound adjectives. And then lastly, we have double dashes. Double dashes act as parentheses. They show extra information. They can be substituted with brackets or with double commas. Dashes, hyphens, and double dashes, all these functions are often mixed up, so make sure you study this. And something that I always recommend to students, no matter what grade you're in, is when you're studying anything with language, language is off by heart learning. It is something that it's right or wrong, which is unlike literature or other sections in English. So this is a chance for you to use apps such as Quizlet, to make flashcards, even make physical flashcards if you don't want to have something digital, but use the flashcards method, because this is something that you just have to get into your head. It's not anything to do with interpretation, this is just pure rote learning. Let's have a look at some examples. So a dash, let's look at this example and you'll see it's indicating explanation or elaboration. Swan Lake is a difficult ballet to perform. Dash, it includes many difficult steps. A hyphen takes the word ice, which is a word by itself, and cream, another word by itself. It joins them together to create an entirely new word. In this case, the compound noun ice cream. Double dashes. Swan Lake, a very famous ballet, will be performed this evening. Notice how what's between the dashes, a very famous ballet, could be omitted from the sentence and the sentence would still make sense. Remember that you can substitute those double dashes with double commas or with brackets. Moving on, we have the colon, the comma, and the semicolon. A colon, in its purest form, sort of indicates the start of a list, but sometimes it can function as a dash a little bit in the sense that it can introduce an explanation or an elaboration. A comma, now this is not a complete list of all the different functions of a comma. There are many functions of a comma. I'm just going to focus on some key ones. A comma separates items on a list. That is the most basic form of the comma. It can also separate a main clause and a subordinate clause when the subordinate clause starts the sentence. It can also be used for direct speech. So when you want to introduce direct speech, introduce your quotation marks or inverted commas, you can say someone said, comma, and then you open those inverted commas. What's important to know about a comma is that it is often used incorrectly by students who are writing. I think that there's this misconception that a comma is just creating a pause in a sentence. And while maybe technically on some level that is true, it is used inaccurately and incorrectly because it's not just something you can just put anywhere if you want to create a pause in your sentence. So what I often see with students of any age is that they, or in any grade, is they just start writing these very long sentences using commas and they think that that is separating their ideas, but actually it doesn't make sense when you just put commas in randomly. And what often happens is that students utilize the comma splice error. This is a really important error because, firstly, as I say, it's used a lot in writing, but also teachers love to ask this in the language section. They'll say, name the punctuation error. And when they ask you to name a punctuation error, it is, quite often the comma splice error. Not always, but often. The comma splice error is when you join two main clauses with a comma. That is not effective, it is not sufficient, it is not accurate. And I'm going to show you in an example on the next slide as to how that happens and why it is inaccurate. But what you can do is that you can take a comma and you can, if you start with the subordinate clause, Remember, a subordinate clause is a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. You can start with a subordinate clause and then put a comma before the main clause to show the relationship between those ideas. However, this does not work when it's two main clauses. A semicolon separates two main clauses which relate to each other. So if you ever want to correct a comma splice error, you can use a semicolon, because a semicolon separates these two main or these two independent clauses. Another way to fix a comma splice error would be to put a full stop, or even to substitute it with a coordinating conjunction. So let's look at examples for colon and comma. I have actually used the same example. As you can see, ballerinas have the following items in their dancing bags: point shoes, comma, elastics, ribbons, and water. So we can see we are listing items. If we're using it as the colon, we can see ballerinas have the following items in their dancing bags, colon. We are introducing a list. We are starting a list. We are indicating we will be listing. If we look at the semicolon example, ballerinas have many items in their bags. They must be prepared for anything. Notice how these are two main clauses. So if I'd used a comma instead of a semicolon, this would be an example of the comma splice error, and I'd need to change it to its current form with the semicolon, or I could put a full stop, or I could put a coordinating conjunction in order for it to make sense. Do you see how it's two sentences or two clauses that can function alone, but they are related to each other, and because of their relation to each other, the semicolon works really well. It makes us understand why the ballerinas have so many items in their bags, because it relates to the second clause, which is that they must be prepared for anything. Now, the last thing we're going to discuss in this video, and as all my students know, this is my pet peeve, apostrophes, because it is always used incorrectly and there is a major misconception around it. With the apostrophe, there are two sort of sections, but I like to think of them as three different functions. Firstly is the easy one, omission or contraction. Contraction is easier to spell, so just learn contraction. Remember, when you're asked the function of an apostrophe, you need to have the terminology with which to answer the question. So you need to use the word omission or contraction. You can't just explain that it is joining the two words. You need to actually have the correct terminology to get that mark. So this is quite simple. This is what you've been learning since you were in grade 2, grade 3, grade 4. Contraction is when you take two words and you're joining them together. And where you have omitted letters, when you've left letters out, that's where you put the apostrophe. I and am together becomes I'm. Just another note, not really related to language, but related to when you're writing essays, is that if you're writing formally, avoid contractions. Rather write I am, cannot, instead of I'm or can't. Secondly, we have singular possession, and you need to be careful. Well, you need to know this terminology, because some teachers are not going to give you the full mark if you just say possession or if you say belonging. You need to be specific and you need to say that it is singular possession. So if we look at the example, the dancer's shoes, I'm indicating here I'm talking about one singular dancer. There is one ballerina, one dancer, and she has shoes. So I'm showing that the shoes belong to the dancer, apostrophe S. And now this is where things sort of fall off the rails. Plural possession. So apostrophes are not used as plurals. It's for plural possession. When you want to show belonging, that something belongs to a group of people, then you use an apostrophe. If you're just talking about the fact that you're buying many oranges, there is no apostrophe necessary. When you are indicating plural possession, the apostrophe goes after the S. So you write your word used in the plural form. So you write the dancers, and then the apostrophe comes after the S to show that the performance belongs to all of the dancers. There are some additional exceptions and other rules, but those are the three main ones for apostrophe. I hope that was helpful. Please remember these punctuation marks and their functions for your specific language questions, but also whenever you're writing anything. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'll see you in the next video. Hi there, and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at simple, compound, and complex sentences. This is a topic that falls under the section in language, but it doesn't always have to be tested just in the language part of your paper. It can come up in comprehension questions or even visual literacy questions such as advertising when you're asked about the verbal techniques. It's also important to know when you're writing your own essay so that you can understand how to use sentence structure effectively, because every type of sentence has a different effect. So firstly, our simple sentence. Our simple sentence, you can remember it as having one finite verb or one main clause. A finite verb is a verb that has tense, number, and subject. So it's one of those main verbs. So my advice is when you are figuring out what type of sentence it is, always go ahead and circle your finite verbs. If you see that there's only one finite verb, then it's probably going to be a simple sentence. So here's an example. Liverpool won the Premier League in 2020. We have one as our finite verb. This is just one main clause. There aren't any commas, there aren't any other clauses going on. This is just a simple sentence. Now, something that you need to keep in mind is that a simple sentence does not necessarily mean a short sentence. Often it tends to be, but this is the way that markers or teachers can often trick students, is that they give you a really long sentence. Maybe there's a lot of listing involved, and they ask you what type of sentence it is, and students will automatically assume it's compound or complex based on the length. But if you look deeper, there's actually only one finite verb. So be wary of that and understand that a simple sentence is not necessarily a short sentence. Now, in terms of the effect of the sentence, what is the effect of using simple sentences? And this is important when you're asked about the style in a comprehension text. You know, what sort of sentence structure is the writer using? How does this convey his or her message effectively? So when using simple sentences, typically the effect is very direct, it's very commanding, and it's very clear, because there's not much else going on. You're getting to the point quickly. So that's typically the effect of a simple sentence. And it can be quite effective if you think of like an advertisement, which has a lot of simple sentences. They're telling you what to do. They're giving you just the relevant information in a very clear, concise manner. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be concise, but it could work really well in that format. A compound sentence. A compound sentence has two or more finite verbs. So you see that trick of circling the finite verbs is going to be super effective, because you will see, okay, one finite verb, it has to be simple, two or more, then I have to consider, is it compound or is it complex? A compound sentence also has a coordinating conjunction, and the easiest way to remember these is fanboys, which stands for, and, nor, but, or, yet so. These are all your short conjunctions. There are a few subordinating conjunctions that are short, but these are your coordinating conjunctions are all short. And my advice here is when you see a conjunction, put a square around it. So circle your finite verbs, put a square around your conjunctions. And then the third point is sort of the thing that you can look for afterwards, is check, is it two main clauses? Remember, a main clause is a clause meaning that it has a finite verb, so it's a group of words with a finite verb that makes sense by itself. It can stand alone as a sentence. That's how you check whether something is a main clause. Also, another word for main clause, you can call it an independent clause, because it is independent, it can stand alone. So if you look at our example, soccer is a very exciting game and it is watched around the world. We have two finite verbs there, we have two main clauses, and it is joined together with a fanboys conjunction. The effect of a compound sentence is that it typically balances two equally important ideas. Often, compound sentences are where you see some comma splice errors, where people use commas instead of using the conjunction that they need to join two independent clauses, so look out for that. But it is more, it's conveying a more complicated idea often than a simple sentence, but they are two ideas of equal importance. And lastly, a complex sentence, Complex sentence is also two or more finite verbs, but now our conjunction is going to be a subordinating conjunction. And these are all the rest of the conjunctions. So because, if, however, although, and there are many others. Remember that subordinated conjunctions can actually start the sentence. And what's important here is that a complex sentence has one main clause and one or more subordinate clauses. A subordinate clause or a dependent clause cannot stand alone. It relies on the main clause in order for it to make sense. So if we look at our example over here, if Liverpool win the trophy, the team will be the best team in England. So you see here, if Liverpool win the trophy, that is your subordinate clause. It cannot stand alone. I can't just write that as a sentence and put a full stop. I have the if, which is starting the sentence, which is the subordinated conjunction. It doesn't always have to start the sentence, but it can. And then if you look at the second clause there, the team will be the best team in England. That actually makes sense by itself. That is the main clause in this example. A complex sentence, the effect of a complex sentence is that it conveys a complicated relationship, and this word relationship is important. It shows the relationship between two ideas, because do you see how each part of the sentence relies on each other in order for it to make sense? So complex is usually conveying a more complicated idea. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found it helpful. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be analysing the concepts of tone and mood. I'm sure as a high school English student you are familiar with these words, or at least you've seen them dotted around your questions in English exam papers, and I'm sure you've also heard your English teachers talk at length about tone and mood. But I know sometimes there is a misconception in terms of what tone and mood exactly are, and also what the differences between these two concepts are. So in today's video, we're going to unpack what tone and mood are. We're going to also discuss how to answer questions on tone and mood, and also how you can harness the power of tone and mood in your own writing. So put very simply, tone is the attitude of the writer towards the material or towards the theme. So whenever you receive a text, always read the text, understand what the main message is, and then think to yourself, what is my writer's attitude towards this particular concept? And mood, put simply, is the atmosphere of the text. So it's how the reader is made to feel about a text. Well, not really about a text actually, but more about the subject matter. So as you can see, tone and mood are not completely different from each other. They are quite similar because the writer's attitude is going to make the reader feel a similar way towards that subject matter. However, you can also notice there is a distinction between tone and mood. They are not identical. So as I alluded to before, you need to understand tone and mood in terms of when you're analysing poetry, comprehension texts, or even visual texts such as advertisements or cartoons. So you need to understand how that speaker or how that writer is conveying their tone and mood. And we're going to talk about how we're going to figure out what the tone and mood are once we actually discuss what words we need to be using to describe tone and mood. And then secondly, as I mentioned earlier, essays and transactional writing, if you have a good knowledge of tone and mood, then you can really harness that power and use those same techniques that other writers use to write, for instance, comprehension texts. You can use those ideas and those strategies and those skills to help your essays and transactional writing actually give over the desired messaging. So when it comes to answering questions on, poetry and comprehension text and visual text, and when your teacher asks you, please will you explain the tone or the mood, remember that we need to be giving an adjective because we are describing a concept. We're describing the writer's attitude, or we're describing the atmosphere of a text. But so often, students write these very vague adjectives to describe the tone and the mood of the text, which really does them no favors, and some teachers are not even going to award marks for that. Why is that? It's because these adjectives are not descriptive enough. They are too vague. They don't actually show that you really understand the writer's attitude or the atmosphere of the text. So words such as happy, sad, good, bad, kind, mean, positive, negative, these are words that younger students can use to describe the writer's attitude. But as a high schooler, you need to go deeper. So you need to understand that you don't just have a positive tone, but that there are many different positive tones within that sort of framework, right? So if you just say positive, it's not being specific enough and you're not showing off your knowledge, because positive could mean perhaps joyous, or it could mean excited, or it could mean celebratory, or it could even mean passionate, right? All of these words are positive words, and so your teacher is not going to be happy if you're just going to say, oh, it's a happy tone, or it's a positive tone, or a negative tone, because they want to see, really, can you actually differentiate what type of tone it is, what type of positive tone it is, or what type of negative mood it is. So the big tip over here is to really be specific when you're answering your questions, and remember to use an adjective always to describe your tone or the mood of a text. Okay, so I know this looks very overwhelming, lots of words on the page, but these are these are tone and mood words. These are adjectives that are actually specific and that can actually get you the marks that you need when you are trying to identify in a comprehension text or in a poem what the tone of what the writer's attitude is, what the tone is, or what the mood is, what is the writer's feeling, the reader's feeling, what is the atmosphere of the text. So if you go online and you search tone and mood words, you are going to find a plethora of words to use that you can study. I have chosen sort of my favorites and have put them on this page. I've stayed away from ones that are really quite challenging and very sort of complicated words, although there might be a couple in here that you may not be you may not know of. So my suggestion is to take these words and to actually go ahead and Google them, search them so you understand what they mean. And another reason why I've selected these particular words is that they're not too specific that they only apply to like one poem out of 100. These are words that you can use for tone and mood of many different texts that I've encountered as a teacher and that my students have encountered as high schoolers. So let's quickly go through all these words. We have celebratory, joyous, excited, admiring, passionate, earnest, eager, animated, ardent, compassionate, dismissive, matter of fact, indifferent, uncertain, defiant, angry, critical, condescending, conversational, depressing, encouraging, disheartening, mournful, hopeful, annoyed, candid, assertive, confident, aggressive, scathing, empathetic, frustrated, informative, mocking, nostalgic, sincere, melancholic, optimistic, pessimistic, regretful, sarcastic, urgent, empowered, reflective, contemplative, foreboding, apprehensive, dejected, disappointed, determined, and cynical. So I hope that you know a couple of these words, and as I said, if you don't, I would suggest that you go and search them, that you write them down on a piece of paper, and when you are answering past paper questions and when you're practicing, try and incorporate these words into your answers. There's no, part of English, I think there's sometimes this understanding that you can't really study for a language. That is definitely not true. This is what you need to study in order to get those tone and mood marks in your questions in your paper 1 comprehension texts and poetry answering for paper 1 or paper 2. So make sure that you study these words and that you understand what they mean and that you have them at your disposal. So when you're sitting in an exam and you have to come up with a word to describe the tone and the mood of a text, you're not sort of just thinking of random words. You have a list in your head that you can go to and turn to and be like, okay, this writer, he sounds frustrated, his attitude is frustrated, and then you've got a brilliant word to use. Another suggestion is whenever you're answering a question for tone and mood, always provide at least 2 or even 3 different tone and mood words, just to make sure you've got the right answer in there for your teacher to see. Okay, so now we understand what words we need to be using to describe the tone and the mood, and we recognize that we have to be specific about it. But then the question still remains of how do we honestly figure out the tone and the mood of a text? So let's go through a couple of things that come up, and you can see the ... at the bottom over here because there's so many different things that are going to alert us to the tone and the mood of a text. But these are some of the most, the ones that crop up the most often that we need to be aware of. So remember that tone and mood are very context dependent. So for instance, if you're studying a poem, try and think of what is the writer's background, what is the poet speaking of, what is the theme. And once you can understand the theme or the context of a text, then it's very clear that, the tone is going to shift in one way or another way. I know I've spoken about, not using positive and negative because these are too vague, these words. But this is sort of, in my opinion, a nice first step is in your head to think about or to put in your brain, is this tone and mood negative or is it positive? And once you're understanding which one is into, which sort of camp it falls into, sometimes it could even be in the neutral camp, then you can start becoming more specific in terms of what tone and mood words you're going to be using. So remember to look at your context. Is this set at a funeral? Okay, then it's probably going to have some sort of mournful tone and depressing mood, right? If you think about it, oh, it's set at a party, then it's going to have a very different perspective. A very important thing to look out for to help you understand the tone and mood of a text is the diction. The diction is the choice of words, because if you're going to use words with connotations of joy, then your tone is going to lean in that direction as well as your mood. If you're going to choose diction with connotations of despair or hopelessness, then your tone and your mood is going to lean in that direction. And this is what I'm talking about when we are discussing things like, or when we discussed earlier, not just even identifying tone and mood, but harnessing the power of tone and mood. So when you're writing a piece, maybe it's a creative essay and you're trying to sound really hopeless, then you need to make sure that the word choice that you're using is indicative of that tone that you have towards the subject material and the mood that you're trying to create. The next thing on the list might look confusing at first, but I've written there tone and mood because if you know the mood of a poem, then you can probably figure out its tone pretty easily. If you know the tone of a comprehension text, then the mood goes hand in hand with it. Pronouns. So have a look at pronouns. These are quite important. The pronouns that I'm talking about here are particularly things like first-person pronouns, second-person pronouns, inclusive pronouns, or exclusive pronouns. These types of pronouns are going to give an indication of how the writer is approaching the subject material and could give you hints about the tone and the mood. If you're seeing a lot of inclusive pronouns like we, us, and our, you're going to notice that the tone is probably could be uplifting, perhaps, right? Trying to unite everyone and show this, the writer's, the attitude or the mood actually is more uplifting and the tone is quite encouraging. So have a look at your pronouns to understand the tone and the mood. Then we have punctuation. So think about the very basic thing that you learned in like grade 2 or grade 3. If you see an exclamation mark, right, it's probably showing some sort of passion, some sort of ardor. So remember that if you see punctuation marks, if you're noticing them, if they're very sort of in your face, then that can lead to the tone and the mood. Sentence style or sentence structure, also really important. If you're seeing a lot of simple sentences, or even a lot of short sentences, the tone can typically come across as quite direct. Sometimes it can even come across as harsh. The mood can therefore be quite commanding. And then we have figures of speech. So have a look at your figures of speech, especially in poetry, but they do come up, even idiomatic expressions, for instance. They come up in, comprehension texts and all different kinds of other texts. And from there you can ascertain what is the writer's attitude towards this, what is the mood that is being created. So I thought that we could quickly go through a little example so I can show you how to analyze what the tone is, how to analyze what the mood is, and what the difference is. So I've taken an extract from a very famous poem by William Blake called London, and I'm just going to read the stanza quickly, and then we're going to talk about how we can ascertain or how we can figure out the tone and the mood. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldiers sigh, runs in blood down palace walls. So immediately something that I notice over here is I'm noticing the diction. I'm noticing the word cry, appalls, hapless, blood, or actually that's more imagery, even blood. And we can see all those words are really steering me towards the negative camp. And if I think more deeply about this, it's not merely just sad, right? Do you see how sad just wouldn't cut it here, because it doesn't actually express the full extent of the meaning and the despair behind the tone and mood of this particular extract. So to me, the attitude of the writer over here, the tone of the poem, could be described as mournful, dejected, reflective, and depressing. He's reflecting on this particular situation of London being in this terrible state, and he's quite mournful and he feels pretty depressed by it all. and therefore the mood, which remember is going to align with it but be slightly different. How do I feel as the reader? What is the atmosphere? Well, the atmosphere that is created is incredibly hopeless, it is depressing, it is melancholic. Melancholic is like a fancier word for sad. So do you see how the hopelessness of the mood is created by the diction, and also the mournfulness of the tone? Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like this video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be talking about diction. We're going to define what it is, and we're also going to talk about how to answer questions that are based on diction. So this is really important for English Paper 1, which is your comprehension paper, your reading paper, where you often have to analyze text, or you always have to analyze texts in paper 1, and you are going to be looking out for the diction, which is the word usage that the writer uses. It's also important to be aware of diction for paper 2, and if you're a DBE student, paper 3 as well, because when you're doing your own form of writing, when you are writing yourself, you need to be aware of the choice of your words and how it impacts the message and the intention which you are trying to relay. So diction is the choice of words, and it sounds like a very simple definition, which it is, but I want you to think about the fact that the English language has many different words. Most words have numerous synonyms that we could have used in their place. So when a writer has selected a certain word, when there is a space to perhaps have communicated that meaning through a different word, the fact that they've selected that particular word is really quite significant. So we need to look closely at the words that the writers have used and see how that relates to their message. And ultimately, if you look at any past papers, any matric past papers, grade 11 past papers of English Paper 1, you will notice there's always going to be some form of a diction question about how do the words, or how have the words been used to impart meaning or to enhance a message or a theme. Remember that sometimes the question can have the word diction in it, so they'll ask you to assess the diction, but otherwise they could ask the question, they could frame it, and they could actually quote a word for you and ask you to then interpret or explain how that word enhances a certain message or theme or tone. So it's important to understand that every single word has two sort of categories, or two things we need to be thinking about, two forms of meaning. So firstly, we have the denotation of a word. The denotation of a word is the literal meaning of the word. It's the dictionary definition. So if you were to go open up a dictionary and search for the word birthday, you would find the literal meaning. It's the day that you are born. If, however, you think about the word birthday more deeply, you're going to come across its connotation. So a connotation is an implied or suggested or figurative meaning. It's the associated meaning that we have with a particular word. So if I think about birthday, I would think about perhaps party, cake, balloons, friends, celebration. So I have all these positive connotations that spring to mind. So here is a little clip from Ted Lasso, and it's a really cool one. I think it's quite funny. If you like Ted Lasso, then you would probably know exactly where this comes from. But I want to talk about the different ways in which we can describe this to really illustrate to you how important denotations versus connotations are. What you're going to notice is all the options that I'm going to provide you have the same denotation. We can use any of these descriptions to describe Ted entering this room. However, the one we're going to ultimately select has the best connotation, which matches the meaning behind this particular scene. So those of you who don't know, this is when after Higgins makes a joke and Ted comes back into the room excitedly. So let's have a look at some of the ways we could describe this. We could say that he opened the door. We could say that he entered the room. We could say he burst through the door. Or we could say he barged into the room. And I've put in bold there for you the different words, and let's understand their denotations and connotations. As you can see, opened, entered, burst, barged, all of these things, all these words have very similar denotations. He's coming into the room. But now we can look at the connotations. If we look at opened the door, it's pretty neutral. The same with entered the room. It doesn't give much away about how he's entering the room. Sure, we can say that, but it's not going to be a really good description if we're trying to describe this to someone who hasn't seen this clip. If I look at burst through the door, that sounds a bit more like the sort of a passion behind behind how he opens the door, right? It shows a little bit more excitement. If you think about the connotations of burst, it's a sense of like, spontaneity. Barged into the room could also work because barged has a connotation of some sort of violence or some sort of strength. So that could also work, but having that sort of little connotation of like barging into the room, it has a little bit of an angry connotation. So in my opinion, the best way to describe this, and think about always, I'm describing this to someone who maybe can't see it, I would say to burst through the door. That would be the best use of the English language, the best word out of these four to describe this. Do you see how it's not just about the denotation when we look at diction, but it's about the connotation? What does the word connote? What do I associate with its meaning? So now let's look at how to answer questions about diction. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of an example here. Remember that diction questions can come up in comprehension, visual literacy, advertising, but also in poetry. So we're going to have a look at a poetry example. So this is one excerpt, one stanza from the famous poem London by William Blake. It says, "In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear." So if we have a look at this question, the question is, explain the effectiveness of the diction. 3 marks. I'm sure you've seen this sort of question before, right? These questions always repeat themselves, just in different contexts. So let's analyze how we would answer this sort of question. Remember, there's so many different ways, there's so many different words that we could really analyze. I've just selected 2 for us to indicate in this answer because it's a 3-mark question. So I'm going to make sure to have 2 examples of diction and explain them for 2 marks, and 1 mark indicating and explaining the effectiveness. So I could say, the repeated use of the word cry invokes connotations of misery and despair. The diction of manacles offers connotations of entrapment and oppression. The diction is therefore effective as it emphasizes the depressing setting of the city and the somber mood of the poem. So as you can see, it's a 3-mark question, and if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that if it's a 3-mark question, I would always recommend that you write 3 sentences to make sure you get every one of your marks. So as you can see, I've quoted the diction, and diction is very important to remember that you must only quote 1 or 2 words at a time and then explain those 1 or 2 words, because you're focusing on the word itself, not how the word is in a sentence per se, but on the connotations of the word itself. So do you see how I've analyzed the connotations of each of the words that I've quoted, and then I've linked that diction, so I've linked those connotations that it invokes to the mood and to the setting. You could also do it to the theme of the poem. So in this particular poem, it's a very somber poem about London in a certain time frame, and it presents a very depressing image and a very depressing message. And so as you can see, the use of these words, these really negative words, but ultimately we can't just write negative in our answer, we have to be more specific, hence the use of misery, despair, entrapment and oppression. So that diction really elevates, emphasizes, highlights and reinforces this theme, this setting and this mood. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video if you enjoyed it, and to subscribe to the Tri-tutors YouTube channel. I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be unpacking what the error of malapropism is. This is an important error to be aware of because in your language and comprehension exam paper, your teacher will often ask you to identify an error that has been made in the text, and it could be malapropism. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what it is and also looking at some examples so that it's easier for you to identify the malapropism error in your exam when you have to. In simple terms, a malapropism is the mistaken use of a similar sounding word. Let's have a look at an example. The doctor administered the anecdote. Anecdote means a short story or an interesting tale, so we can see that this word has been used incorrectly. The correct word is a similar sounding one, the word antidote, which means a cure. So as you can see, the sentence should have been the doctor administered the antidote. So by changing anecdote into antidote, we have eliminated the error of malapropism and presented a correct sentence. Now for a bit more of a challenging one, this is unparalleled in history. The word unparalleled is incorrect, it should be unparalleled. This is unparalleled in history, meaning it hasn't happened before. This is an exceptional case. Now let's have a look at some examples from the TV show The Office. So here Michael says, "They're trying to make me an scapegoat." He doesn't really mean an scapegoat. He has used a similar sounding word that is mistaken. He is really trying to say, they're trying to make me a scapegoat, which is meaning, they're blaming him for something. Another example is, "They are in for a bit of surprise. I'm not to be truffled with." He really means I'm not to be trifled with, meaning I'm not to be treated badly. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video, we're going to be discussing ambiguity. We're going to talk about what it is and go through some examples. So there are various kinds of ambiguity. We're not going to delve too deeply into the details of the different kinds, but rather we're going to focus our study on some examples and how to correct some examples. So ambiguity is when there is more than one possible interpretation. There is a double meaning or the meaning is unclear. This can refer to one particular word that is messed up the sentence. That can mean it has two potential meanings, or it can refer to the construction of the sentence itself. Ambiguity is usually tested in a paper 1 context. Either your teacher or your examiner will ask you directly to identify the ambiguity, or they might even ask you to correct the ambiguity based on the context. So you need to read the context, you need to read the paragraph, understand what the intended meaning was, and then you'd be able to correct it. If you need to identify it, then you have to show the two possible meanings that could come out of that sentence. But ambiguity can also come up in adverts or cartoons to create a sense of humor. It can be used as a technique of humor in that way because someone could misinterpret the meaning of the sentence that is being said by another character, and this could lead to humorous results. Another thing to be aware of with ambiguity is that it is an error, and so when you're writing your essays, so not in paper 1, but when you're answering your other exam questions in different papers, be aware that you need to avoid ambiguity at all costs, because ambiguity is going to make it unclear to read what you want to say. So it's going to impede the readability of your essay, and therefore it's something that you would want to avoid at all costs. I know that a lot of students do struggle with ambiguity, and I think the reason is because we are exposed to so much ambiguity in real life, in daily contexts, and yet we automatically assume the correct sort of interpretation based on the context. So that's why it can be a bit challenging to identify it within a paragraph or within a passage. And so my advice is to really read through everything in a super detailed way and think about what potentially this could be interpreted as, even if you automatically saw the correct interpretation as you were reading it through based on the context. So I'm going to read through some examples on this slide, and I want you to think about the potential ambiguity, and then on the next slide we're going to go through the two possible meanings and of each of these sentences. So let's go through them and let's see if you can figure them out before I get to the answers on the next slide. I drops off the shelf. She saw him with the telescope. He fed her cat food. The cow is ready to eat. After rotting in the basement for weeks, my friend brought up some fruit. So pause the video if you want and try and figure out the 2 possible meanings for each of these sentences. Okay, so if we were asked to identify the ambiguity, eye drops off the shelf, we could say, well, either an actual eye has dropped off the shelf, or eye drops are no longer being sold, they're off the shelf or off the shelves. If you had to correct it, then you would just choose either one of these sentences based on the context in which you're given which one the writer was intending to convey. She saw him with the telescope. Well, this can mean she saw him through the telescope, so she was the one looking through the telescope, or she saw the man who has a telescope, so she saw a man who was using a telescope. He fed her cat food, so he either fed a woman the cat food, or he fed her cat some of the food. The cow is ready to eat, so either the cow is ready to eat its meal, or the cow has been prepared and is ready for people to eat it. And the last one is slightly different because really there's only one possible intention behind the sentence, but it has been constructed in such a way that it is ambiguous. After rotting in the basement for weeks, my friend brought up some fruit. We could rather say, after the fruit was rotting in the basement for weeks, my friend brought it up. So these are some real-life examples of signs which have ambiguity, and I think that once you see these and understand them, you are going to see a lot of signs just in everyday life where you'll notice the ambiguity. So I'm not going to explain them, I'm rather going to read them through and see if you guys can figure out the ambiguity in the comments. So the first one says, slow children at play. Don't let worries kill you, let the church help. Do not chain bicycles to poles. These will be removed and disposed of without notice. Smoking bare feet pets prohibited in building. Cows, please drive slowly. So hopefully these are some fun examples that you can analyze and assess the ambiguity and understand what the intended meaning was versus what a possible interpretation can be. Thank you for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please remember to like the video and to subscribe to the Tri-tutors channel.